a man shut out the world, a woman abandoned by her entire town, and a child kneeling in the cold snow begging passers-by to stop. But no one looks down. This is the story of Silas Boone, the cowboy with the scar on his face and a heart frozen for years. What would make such a man dismount and save a complete stranger? Follow the story to the end and leave a comment with the city you're viewing from so I know how far this story has come. The boy had been kneeling for so long that he'd stopped feeling his knees. That was the worst part. Not the cold itself, but the way it had quietly stopped hurting. Noah Hale was 8 years old, and he understood, in the wordless way that children sometimes understand terrible things, that when your body stops complaining about the cold, that means the cold has already won. He pressed his mother's hand between both of his. Her fingers were the color of candle wax. Her chest still moved. He kept checking, kept watching for the small rise and fall beneath her coat, but she hadn't opened her eyes in nearly an hour, and the bench they were sitting on had frost climbing up its legs like something alive trying to swallow them whole. "Mama," he said, for the 14th time. He'd lost count after 10, but started counting again because counting gave him something to do. "Mama, wake up!" She didn't. Black Ridge, Wyoming Territory was not a large town. It had a general store, a livery, a saloon that tried to look respectable by keeping its piano tuned, a land office that everyone used and nobody trusted, and maybe 230 people who all knew each other's names and most of each other's business. On a morning like this one, gray sky pressing down like a lid, wind cutting through the main street at an angle that found every gap in every coat, most of those 230 people had somewhere to be that was not outside. The ones who were outside walked past. Noah watched them. He wasn't crying. He'd cried earlier, back when he first understood that his mother wasn't going to stand up on her own, but he'd run out of whatever crying required, and now he just watched. An older man in a canvas coat glanced toward the bench and then looked at the mud. A woman in a wool shawl slowed her pace for half a second before deciding that whatever was happening on that bench was not her concern. Two men talking outside the land office looked over, exchanged something quiet, and kept talking. Nobody stopped. Noah was not surprised. They'd arrived in Black Ridge 6 days ago, he and his mother, on a wagon that belonged to someone else. In those 6 days, he'd learned a few things about this town. The bread at the general store cost more than it should. The man who ran the land office had a way of smiling that didn't involve his eyes, and Black Ridge did not extend itself to strangers, especially strangers who arrived without money or men to speak for them. His mother had tried. He'd watched her try. She'd gone to 3 different households looking for laundry work or kitchen work or any work at all, and she'd been turned away from each one with varying degrees of politeness, and each time she came back to the small room they were renting above the saloon, half the size of the room they'd had before everything fell apart. She'd been a little quieter, a little more careful with her movements, like she was conserving something. Then 2 nights ago she'd started coughing, and by yesterday morning the cough had become a fever, and by this morning the fever had become this. His mother unconscious on a bench in the freezing cold because their landlord had locked them out of their room while she was still sick, because they owed 3 days' rent, and he hadn't believed Noah when Noah said his mother would pay it as soon as she was able. "Please," Noah said, to no one in particular, to the street, to the gray sky. "Please, somebody." Another man walked past. He was carrying a crate of something, and he kept his eyes fixed on the far end of the street with the particular determination of someone who has decided in advance not to see certain things. Noah looked down at his mother's face. There was a small scar on her chin from when she'd fallen off a fence when she was young. She'd told him that story once, made it funny, made him laugh. Her eyelashes had frost on them. He didn't know when that had happened. He heard the horse before he saw it. Not the sound of hooves on packed dirt. The sound came first as a kind of presence, something that changed the texture of the street's noise, and then he looked up and saw the white horse coming down the center of Black Ridge's main street at an unhurried walk. The horse was enormous, or seemed so to an 8-year-old kneeling on a frozen bench. It was white in the way that old snow is white. Not clean exactly, but solid, real, indifferent to whether you found it beautiful. The man on its back was harder to look at directly. He was large in the way that men who have spent their lives working become large. Not just height or weight, but presence, a kind of density, as though the air around him had been compressed by years of hard use. He wore a heavy coat the color of charcoal and a hat that had been through weather more than once, and a scarf pulled up around his jaw. But the scarf had slipped slightly, and even from across the street Noah could see the scar, a long, raised, irregular thing that ran from below the man's left ear down across his jaw and disappeared under his collar. It looked old. It looked like something that had tried to take him and hadn't quite managed it. Silas Boone had not intended to come into town today. He'd intended to check the east fence line where one of his hands, he only had one now, old Marty, who was worth 3 ordinary men, but who was currently laid up with a broken wrist, had reported some damage from last week's ice storm. He'd intended to check the fence, note what needed repairing, and return to the ranch in time to feed the horses their late morning. He'd come into town only because he'd remembered at the last minute that he was almost out of lamp oil, and you could not afford to run out of lamp oil in a Wyoming winter unless you enjoyed spending your evenings sitting in the dark with your thoughts, which Silas Boone did not. He was going to ride straight to the general store, buy the oil, and leave. He had lived on the edge of Black Ridge for 11 years, and he had made this transaction: enter, acquire what is needed, depart, into something close to a discipline. He was not unfriendly, exactly. He paid his debts, he kept his fences, he did not cause trouble, but he had learned in the slow and painful way that most real lessons are learned, that the space between himself and other people was easier to maintain than to close, and considerably harder to reestablish once closed. The scar helped, in a manner of speaking. People tended not to linger when looking at him. He had made peace with that. He was almost past the bench when the boy looked up. Silas had not meant to make eye contact. He had been watching the road ahead with the automatic vigilance of a man who has ridden a lot of miles alone. But something made him glance, some peripheral awareness of smallness in an unlikely place. And when he did, he saw the boy's face. He had seen frightened faces before. He had seen grief and desperation and the specific hollow expression of people who have exhausted their options. What stopped him, what made him pull the reins before he'd consciously decided to, was not any of those things exactly. It was the quality of stillness in the boy's eyes. The way he was looking at Silas not with hope, because hope had apparently already come and gone, but with something more basic than hope. Recognition, maybe. The simple acknowledgement of one living creature by another. Silas stopped the horse. He sat there for a moment, looking at the woman on the bench. He could see from the saddle that she was breathing. He could also see that she was not going to be breathing somewhere comfortable and warm without assistance, and that the boy kneeling beside her was not large enough to provide that assistance himself. He looked up the street, then down. The people of Black Ridge continued their mourning. He got down from the horse. The snow under his boots was packed hard, and it creaked as he walked to the bench. Up close, the woman looked worse. Young or youngish, mid-30s maybe, which wasn't old but which was old enough to have collected some trouble, with dark hair coming loose from a braid and skin that had gone past pale into something that concerned him. He touched the back of his hand to her forehead and felt the heat through his glove. Fever. Bad one. The boy had not moved. He was watching Silas with those still, careful eyes, like an animal that hasn't decided yet whether to run. "Your mother?" Silas said. "Yes, sir." "How long's she been like this?" "Since last night. She got worse this morning." The boy hesitated. "The man at the hotel said we had to leave." Silas looked at the boy's coat. It was thin. Adequate for a mild autumn, maybe. Completely wrong for a January morning in Wyoming. He straightened up and looked at the bench, and at the woman, and made a calculation. "All right," he said. He bent down and got his arms under Clara Hale, one arm beneath her shoulders, one beneath her knees, and lifted. She was lighter than she should have been, which told him something about the days before this one. He turned toward his horse. The horse stood patiently, as it always did, because he had spent considerable time teaching it patience. "Can you ride?" he asked the boy. Noah stared at him. "A little." "Good enough." Silas looked around. There was a wooden step stool someone had left outside the general store, probably for the older customers to mount their wagons. He moved toward it, his arms still full of the unconscious woman, and nodded his head in its direction. "Drag that over." The boy did, without questioning it. Silas noted that. "Climb up, get in the saddle. I'm going to hand your mother up to you to hold, then I'll ride behind and take her." I don't know if I can, You don't have to do it long, Silas said. Just long enough. The horse was called Ghost, which was not a name Silas had chosen. The animal had come with it, and it had seemed foolish to change something a horse was already used to. Ghost stood without moving while the boy climbed up, while Silas carefully transferred the unconscious woman up into the saddle, while Noah gripped his mother with the focused desperation of someone doing the most important thing they've ever done. Then Silas put his foot in the stirrup and swung up behind them both, settling his weight so that he could take Clara from her son's arms and hold her against his chest. "Hold the horn," he told Noah. "Don't let go." "Where are we going?" the boy asked. "My ranch," Silas said. "It's about 2 miles. Noah turned to look at him, just briefly. "Why?" Silas had already started the horse moving. He was quiet long enough that Noah probably thought he wasn't going to answer. "She lives," he finally said. "That's enough." Gotit. The Boone Ranch sat in a shallow valley between 2 low ridges, which gave it some protection from the worst of the winter wind and absolutely no protection from the particular kind of loneliness that came from being the only building visible in any direction for a considerable distance. Silas had built most of it himself, over years, when he'd had more purpose and different reasons for building. The main house was solid and larger than one man needed, with a good stone fireplace and windows that let in the afternoon light. The barn was better maintained than the house, which was not unusual for ranchers, but the house was not falling down. Things had been neglected but not destroyed. It looked empty from the road. Most people who passed, and not many did, because his road wasn't a through road to anywhere, assumed it was abandoned. It wasn't. It was just quiet. He got Clara inside and onto the bed in the spare room, which still had blankets on it because he never took blankets off beds. It seemed like unnecessary work. And he sent Noah to get wood from the pile outside while he started a fire. The boy came back with more wood than Silas had asked for, carrying it in 2 trips with the methodical efficiency of someone accustomed to making himself useful. Silas noticed this too. He boiled water. He had some dried herbs that old Marty had taught him were good for fever. Marty was useless at fencing and bookkeeping, but had a grandmother's knowledge of plants and remedies that had proven valuable more than once. He did what he knew to do, which wasn't much beyond keeping her warm and getting liquid into her when she was conscious enough to swallow, and he tried to do it without making a production of it. The boy sat in the chair beside the bed and watched his mother breathe. Around noon she stirred, not fully awake, not coherent, but stirred, murmured something, moved her head. Silas had been in the kitchen making a kind of soup that was mostly just hot water with some dried meat and a potato because it was what he had and because hot liquid was what she needed. He heard the movement and came to the doorway. Noah had his mother's hand. He was saying something to her too quiet for Silas to hear. Silas went back to the kitchen and did not interrupt them. "About to see." She was more awake by evening. Not well. She was nowhere close to well, but her eyes were open and tracking, and she knew where she was in the basic sense of knowing that she was inside and warm. She looked at the ceiling of the room for a long time before she turned her head and saw her son asleep in the chair beside her, and something in her face went very soft and very painful to witness. And Silas, who had been standing in the doorway to ask if she could eat something, stepped back into the hallway and waited. He heard her say Noah's name, quiet. He heard the boy wake up with a sharp inhale, the way children do when they've fallen asleep sitting up. He heard the murmur of their voices, but not the words. After a while, he knocked on the door frame. "Can you eat?" he asked. Clara Hale looked at him from the bed. He watched her take in his face, watched the almost involuntary moment of adjustment that people had when they first really looked at the scar, the slight recalibration, and then watched her move past it. "Who are you?" she asked. Her voice was rough from the cough. "Silas Boone," he said. "I have a ranch. You're at it." She looked at her son. Noah gave her a small nod. "He carried you," Noah said, "on his horse." Clara turned back to Silas. He couldn't read her expression entirely. There was something in it beyond the expected gratitude or confusion, something like she was trying to place him, like a name that was on the tip of her tongue. "Thank you," she said finally. "Don't thank me yet," Silas said. "You still have a fever. Can you eat something?" "I think so." He brought the soup. It wasn't good soup. He knew this. He was not under any illusions about his cooking, but it was hot, and she drank it. Noah ate from a second bowl sitting cross-legged on the end of the bed, and Silas stood near the door and said nothing and tried not to notice how different the room felt with people in it. He wasn't sure he had words for how it felt different. He stayed near the door anyway. The next 3 days were a rhythm of small, necessary things. Silas fed the horses and checked the stock and assessed the fence damage from the safety of not having to ride out in the worst of the cold, because the worst of the cold had eased slightly, as Wyoming cold sometimes did when it felt like being merciful. He made food, not good food, but functional food, the kind that kept a person from getting worse. He brought it to the room and left it, and did not linger. The boy started following him, not aggressively, not in the way of a child who demanded attention. Noah Hale was, Silas was beginning to understand, a different kind of child than most, quieter and more observant, with a tendency to watch something carefully before deciding to engage with it, which was honestly a trait Silas respected in most living creatures. He started appearing at the barn door in the mornings. He started asking questions that were specific rather than general. Not, what do you do all day, but why is that horse's leg wrapped like that? And how do you know when the water trough is frozen all the way through versus just on top? Silas answered him. Briefly, at first, then with more detail, because the boy asked follow-up questions that showed he'd actually listened to the first answer. On the fourth morning, Noah helped him break ice on the water trough without being asked. Silas looked at him. I watched how you did it yesterday, Noah said. Silas handed him the second iron bar and they worked opposite ends of the trough. The boy had good instincts for the angle and didn't waste motion. Silas thought about saying so, and then didn't. Inside the house, Clara Hale was sitting up. She was not well enough to be up. He'd told her this when he'd looked in at mid-morning. But she was sitting up in the bed with her back against the headboard, and there was color in her face that hadn't been there 3 days ago. She had found a book on the nightstand. It was a surveying manual, the only book in the spare room, because he'd put it there years ago and forgotten it, and she was reading it with the attentive expression of someone who reads anything available when they have nothing else to do. She looked up when he appeared in the doorway. Surveying, she said, and held up the cover. I know, he said. Is it interesting? He considered. Parts of it. She put the book down. Your son is outside. He's not my son. I know. She said it without apology, just clarifying that she knew what she'd said. Noah is outside. He seems happy. Silas didn't reply to this. Mr. Boone, Clara said. She said it carefully, like she was testing the name. Why did you bring us here? He'd been waiting for the question. He'd been trying to figure out, in the days since he'd ridden into town, what the honest answer was. He'd turned it over and hadn't arrived at anything satisfying. You were in the street, he said. Other people saw me in the street. Yes. And didn't stop. Yes. She looked at him steadily. He met her eyes for a moment and then looked somewhere slightly past her shoulder, which was a habit he'd developed over years of having a face that made direct eye contact uncomfortable for other people. They were afraid, she said. It was not a question or an accusation, more like a statement of fact she'd been carrying for a while. Probably, he said. Of what? I don't know. Getting involved, maybe. Whatever you were involved in. He paused. Were you involved in something? She was quiet a beat too long. I'll explain when I'm stronger, she said. All right. Does that bother you, that I'm not explaining now? He thought about it honestly. No. You can explain or not explain. You're here either way until you're well enough to be somewhere else. She looked at him in a way that was hard to characterize. Not quite suspicion, not quite gratitude, something in between, something uncertain. You're a strange man, Mr. Boone, she said. Most people would agree with you, he said, and went back to the horses. On the fifth day, she managed to walk to the kitchen under her own power, holding the wall, and then the door frame, and then the back of the chair. Silas was at the table doing the kind of accounting he despised, tracking what he'd spent and what he'd earned and trying to make the two columns produce a number he could live with. And he looked up when she appeared and then looked back at the ledger. Sit down before you fall down, he said. She sat down. He heard her exhale with the effort of having made it from the bedroom. "There's coffee," he said. "It's been on a while. It's not good." "I'll have some anyway." He got up and poured it. He put it in front of her and returned to the ledger. She wrapped both hands around the cup and didn't say anything for a while. "Noah is outside again," she said. "He's been helping with the horses," Silas said. "He told me. He has good instincts." Clara Hale looked at her coffee. Something shifted in her expression, moved through it like weather, complicated and quick. "He used to be afraid of horses," she said. Silas kept his eyes on the ledger but wasn't reading it. "He was afraid of a lot of things," she said. "Before." She said the word before with the particular weight that it carries when it means something specific. "He's not the same as he was before." "Before what?" She was quiet again. Outside he could hear Noah's voice, saying something to one of the horses, the particular kind of one-sided conversation that children sometimes held with animals, patient and earnest. Ghost apparently found this acceptable because he didn't hear the horse moving away. "My husband died 14 months ago," Clara said. "An accident. He worked in the mines, and there was a collapse, and—" She stopped, started again. "After that, I couldn't keep the house. I had no money and no family close by, and there was a man named Harlan Voss who offered to help." Silas recognized the name in the way you recognize a bad smell in the dark. Not from having encountered the man personally, but from the way his name moved through the territory. Harlan Voss ran cattle in the eastern part of the county and had a reputation for the kind of business dealing that was legal only because the men who wrote the laws owed him favors. "He offered to help," Silas repeated. "That was how he said it. Help. He said he would clear my husband's debts and give me work, keeping his household accounts. He was very specific about the terms. I thought it was—" She stopped. "I thought I understood the agreement. But you didn't. What I thought I'd signed and what I'd actually signed were not the same document." She said this flatly, the way someone says something they've rehearsed not reacting to. "I found out 6 weeks later when I asked about leaving. He showed me the contract. I was bound to him for 3 years. If I left before that, he had the right to sue for damages. Damages that were higher than anything I could ever pay." She looked up from her coffee. "And there was a clause about Noah." Silas put down his pen. "If I left without fulfilling the contract," Clara said, "or if I was judged to have violated it in any way, he had the legal right to place Noah in an orphanage until I'd made full restitution." Her voice was completely steady. He understood that this steadiness was a choice, that it cost her something. "He's used it before. With other women. It's how he keeps them." The kitchen was quiet. Outside, Noah's voice floated through the window, something about whether ghosts liked apples, and if so, where Silas kept them. "You ran," Silas said. "I ran," Clara said. "I took Noah and I ran, and I got us as far as Black Ridge before I ran out of money, and then I got sick and—" She stopped. "Voss will have people looking for us. That's why the town—" She gestured, a small, exhausted motion. "They'll have heard his name. Nobody wants to be on the wrong side of Harlan Voss." Silas looked at the window, at the gray winter light coming through it. He sat with this information. He turned it over. He was aware that the reasonable thing, the uncomplicated thing, the thing that served his interest in maintaining the particular quiet life he had built around himself, was to arrange for a wagon to take Clara Hale and her son somewhere else as soon as she was strong enough. He was aware that what she had told him had nothing to do with him, and that he had already done more than most men in his position would have done. He was also aware that he could still hear the boy outside, talking to his horse about apples, and that this was the first time Ghost had let anyone else that close voluntarily. "There are apples," he said, "in the cellar, barrel on the left." Clara blinked. "For the horse," he said, "if the boy wants to give him one." She looked at him for a long moment. He picked up his pen and went back to the ledger. That night, he sat at the kitchen table after everyone was asleep. He'd given Clara the spare room and put an extra blanket down for Noah on the narrow cot in what had been intended as a storeroom, but which served as one, and he sat with the lamp burning low and thought about Harlan Voss. He'd known men like that. Not Voss specifically, but the type. Men who understood that the law, written by men for men, could be bent in certain directions if you knew where to put your weight. Men who weaponized paper the way other men weaponized fists, with the added advantage that paper left fewer visible marks. He'd been the subject of that kind of paper once, briefly, long enough to understand what it felt like. His hand went to his jaw without him meaning it to, and he stopped it. He thought about Clara's face when she'd said the word before. He thought about Noah, who was afraid of horses and then wasn't. He thought about what it meant that the entire town of Black Ridge had walked past a sick woman and a kneeling child, and that the reason for this was a single man's name. He didn't make any decisions that night, but when he blew out the lamp and went to bed, he lay in the dark for a long time, listening to the wind move past the windows of a house that was, for the first time in a while, not empty. And something in that sound, or in the absence that was no longer quite an absence, settled in him like the first warmth of a fire that's finally caught, slow, uncertain, but undeniable. He closed his eyes. Outside, the snow kept falling over the Boone Ranch, and the windows were dark, and from the road it looked like it always looked, but it wasn't. The snow stopped on the 6th morning. Clara noticed it first. The quality of the light through the window had changed, gone from the flat gray of a sky still working to the sharper, colder blue of a sky that had finished. She lay still for a moment after waking, listening, and realized that what she was hearing was silence. Not the thick, pressured silence of a storm holding its breath, but the wide, open silence of a world that had settled. She felt marginally better. Not well. But the fever had broken sometime in the night and left behind the particular exhausted clarity that fevers do. Everything slightly too bright, her own body feeling provisional, like she was borrowing it and would need to return it shortly. Her chest still hurt when she breathed deep, but she was thinking straight, which was an improvement over the past 4 days, during which she had been aware of things happening around her without being able to connect them into anything coherent. She remembered pieces. The horse. The cold. Noah's face, which she'd fixed on like a point on a horizon whenever consciousness floated close enough to grab. A man's arms lifting her. That she remembered more as sensation than image, the solidity of it, the fact of being carried when she'd stopped being able to carry herself. Silas Boone. She'd looked at him the way you look at a man you think you might have seen before, when you can't quite place where. Something about the set of his shoulders, or the way he moved, deliberate without being slow, had snagged at a memory she couldn't fully retrieve. She let it go and sat up. The dizziness came and she waited for it to pass, which it did, reluctantly. She found her boots by the door. Someone had cleaned the worst of the mud off them, which she hadn't done herself and which Noah was not tall enough to have managed easily. She put them on and stood up and made her way to the kitchen. Silas was not inside. She could hear him in the barn through the kitchen's small rear window. Boots on packed earth. The sound of a grain bucket. Noah was still asleep. She'd checked the storeroom before she came down, seen the small shape of him buried under the extra blanket with one arm hanging off the edge of the cot. She built the fire back up from the coals because the kitchen had gone cold and she knew how to do that much at least. She found the coffee. She made it badly. Not wrong, exactly, but she'd used slightly too much water and the result was weak in a way that she suspected Silas would notice but probably wouldn't mention. He came in from the cold about 20 minutes later, stamping snow off his boots at the door. He looked at her by the stove and seemed to do a quick, careful assessment, the kind a person does when they're trying to judge whether someone is actually better or just convince themselves they are. "You're up," he said. Apparently. He came to the table and sat down. He pulled off his gloves and set them on the edge. He looked at the coffee she'd poured for him, lifted the cup, drank without comment. "I made it wrong," she said. "It's fine." It wasn't, and they both knew it, and neither of them said so again. She sat across from him. This was the first time she'd been at this table in a way that felt intentional rather than incidental. The first time she'd come to it as a person rather than a patient. She noticed things she hadn't from the bedroom doorway. The ledger still open on the far end of the table, the numbers in it written in a cramped, careful hand. A coffee ring on the wood from a cup set down many times in the same spot. A crack in the wall near the window that had been filled with something gray and practical. Not fixed, just managed. "How long have you lived here?" she asked. 11 years? Alone? He looked at her. Mostly. She accepted this. She wrapped her hands around her cup the way she had yesterday and looked at it. I've been trying to remember where I know you from, she said. Something moved across his face. Not much, just a small shift. You probably don't, he said. I think I do. She looked up. Were you ever in a town called Merritt Crossing? The pause was brief but present. Passed through, he said. 8 years ago, she said slowly, following the thread of it. There was a blacksmith shop. Well, it was more of a forge, really, attached to the back of the hardware store. Something went wrong with the furnace. The whole front section caught. She was watching him. They were saying there was a man inside. Silas looked at his coffee. I pulled him out, she said. I was 17. I was the only one close enough. Everybody else was already on the other side of the street. She paused. You had a different coat then. Brown. He was quiet for a long moment. Green, he said. The coat was green. She blinked. Then something happened in her face. Not relief exactly, because she hadn't known she was looking for confirmation, but the particular release of a thing that's been hovering unresolved for a long time finally settling. Green, she said. I remember the buttons. Silas turned his coffee cup a quarter turn on the table. He didn't look at her. She watched his jaw, the scar running down it, and understood now where it had come from, or at least where it had started. I didn't see you leave, she said. Afterwards, I thought... She stopped. I wasn't dead, he said. I know. I mean, I know now. She shook her head slowly. I was 17. I went home and I didn't sleep for 2 nights. And then I put it away because that's what you do when you're 17, and you've seen something like that, and there's nothing else to do with it. She paused. You never came back through Merritt Crossing? No. Why not? He was quiet again in that way he had. Not evasive, just slow, like he believed words were resources to be spent carefully. I went north, he said. Found this land. Stayed. Clara looked around the kitchen, at the walls, the window, the ledger, the crack that had been filled but not repaired. Why did you stay? She asked. It's a long way from everywhere. He considered this longer than she expected. That was the point, he said. She understood that. She understood it in the way you understand something that rhymes with your own experience. Not identical, but related. She had spent 14 months trying to find a distance between herself and the life that had collapsed, and she hadn't found it yet, and she knew what it was to be trying. She didn't say so. Instead, she said, I didn't know it was you. When you carried me. I still don't entirely... She stopped and then started differently. I'm glad it was you. He looked at her then, directly, which she'd noticed he didn't do often. His eyes were dark gray and had the quality of eyes that have spent a lot of time scanning distances. Don't read too much into it, he said. I'm not, she said. I just mean, I'm glad it wasn't nobody. He seemed to accept this. He picked up his gloves and his cup and stood. I'm going to fix the east fence today, he said. The boy can come if he wants to. He'll want to, Clara said. Well, Noah did want to. He was up and at the barn door before Silas had finished loading the repair supplies into the small flatbed, wearing a look of focused readiness that Silas recognized as the expression of a person who is deeply aware they haven't been formally invited and is hoping urgency will substitute. Can I come? Noah asked. Silas looked at him. Can you drive a team? No? I'll teach you the basics on the way out. Pay attention. The look on the boy's face at I'll teach you was something Silas made a point of not examining too closely. The east fence ran along the low rise that marked the property's edge, about 1.5 miles out from the house. The damage was what he'd expected from ice. Not dramatic, not catastrophic, but real. 2 posts heaved sideways by the freeze-thaw cycle, one section of wire snapped clean, another section sagging. He worked, and Noah handed him tools and held the wire, and did what he was told with a minimum of fuss and a maximum of observation. Around mid-morning, working a stubborn post back into alignment, Silas said without particularly planning to, "What did you do before?" "In the house you lived in." Noah thought about it. "Helped with the washing, brought wood in, fed the chickens." He paused. "We had a garden. I used to weed it." "Did you like it?" Another pause. Longer. "I liked when things grew," Silas got the post plum and held it there. Hand me the tamper. Noah handed it over. Silas worked the earth back around the base, tamping it down in layers. My father planted things, Noah said. Not to Silas specifically, more to the fence post. He said you had to be patient with a garden, that you could do everything right and still lose things, and that wasn't your fault, that was just growing. Silas tamped. The ground was resistant, still hard from the freeze. He was right, Silas said. Noah looked at him. He seemed slightly surprised that Silas had engaged with this rather than letting it pass, which was fair because Silas was somewhat surprised himself. Do you have a garden? Noah asked. Not anymore. Did you? Silas straightened up and looked out over the flat white of the east pasture. There was one. It didn't get tended. Noah seemed to understand from the way Silas said this that there was something behind it that wasn't being said, and he did not push. Instead, he looked out at the pasture alongside Silas for a moment, the way someone joins you in looking at something because the looking itself is the companionship. Maybe in spring, Noah said. Silas looked down at him. The boy was already moving to the next section of damaged wire, pulling on his work gloves with the serious concentration of someone who has decided something without saying it out loud. Silas picked up his tools and followed. What? Inside the house, Clara found the broom. She hadn't asked. There was no reason she needed to ask. She was in the kitchen and could see the corners and the floor and the windows, and her hands were her hands, and they did not stay idle well when the rest of her was restless. The house wasn't dirty, exactly. It was more like a house that had been maintained at the level of functional without any attention to the level of inhabited. Things were where they needed to be. Nothing was warm. She swept the kitchen first. Then she found a cloth and wiped down the surfaces, and she found behind the stove a buildup of grease and ash that had been there long enough to have formed opinions. She dealt with it. She found the window had a crack in its putty that was letting cold air in at the corner, and she couldn't fix that, but she noted it. She reorganized the shelf above the stove where the cooking supplies were. Not to impose order, but because the arrangement made no practical sense. With the salt behind everything and the flour in front of things you'd need daily. She made soup for the midday meal. Real soup this time, with more of the dried meat, and 2 of the 3 remaining potatoes and some dried onions she found in a small tin at the back of a shelf. She started it early, so it would have time. Around noon, she sat down with the surveying manual again. She'd finished it, more or less, and found it genuinely interesting in a way she hadn't expected. She had a head for numbers, and had always had one, which was how she'd gotten the accounting work and how she'd understood, eventually, and too late, exactly what Harlan Voss's contract had done to her. She didn't want to think about Voss. She thought about him anyway. The cold fact was this: she was better, which was good, and because she was better, she would soon be well enough to leave. And once she was well enough to leave, she would have to leave, because she could not stay in a stranger's house indefinitely, even a stranger who had turned out not to be quite a stranger. She had no money. She had no job. She had a son and a coat, and whatever determination had gotten her through the last 14 months, which was apparently enough to survive with, but not quite enough to plan with. Voss's men would be looking. She knew this. She'd been in Black Ridge 6 days before she collapsed, long enough for the wrong person to have noticed her name or her face or the direction she'd come from. She had not exactly been discreet. You couldn't be discreet when you were asking everyone in town if they had work for a woman with a child. She put the book down and stared at the wall. She would figure it out. She always figured it out. This was both her best quality and the most exhausting thing about herself. The soup was ready when Silas and Noah came back in from the cold. Silas stopped in the kitchen doorway when he smelled it, just for a half second, a small interruption in his movement, and then came to the table and sat down. Noah was already at the wash basin, scrubbing his hands with the efficiency of someone who has been told to wash his hands enough times that it's now automatic. Silas looked at the pot on the stove and then around the kitchen, which looked different than it had this morning, though he didn't say this. "You didn't need to cook," he said. "I know," Clara said. She ladled soup into the bowls she'd found on the second shelf. "Do you want bread? There's no bread." "I was going to make some this afternoon, but I ran out of time." "There's no bread anyway," Silas said. "I'm out of flour." "I moved the flour." "I know. I can see where you moved it." She set the bowls on the table. It makes more sense where I put it. I've been getting along fine with it where it was. You've been getting along, she agreed. Fine is arguable. Noah, arriving at the table, looked between them with the alert stillness of a child who has learned to read adult conversations for weather. Silas looked at his soup. He picked up the spoon. It's better than what I make, he said, which for him, Clara was beginning to understand, was the same as a compliment. Low bar, she said. He almost did something with his mouth that might have been the beginning of something resembling a smile. She wasn't certain. It happened quickly and then was gone. How's the fence? She asked. Fixed. Noah help? He held the wire, Silas said. Didn't complain. Noah looked up from his soup with an expression that was trying very hard not to be pleased. He's good at the horses, Silas added. He said it to the middle of the table rather than to anyone specifically. Ghost doesn't usually take to people. Clara looked at her son, who was now applying himself to his soup with intense focus. Noah's always been good with animals, she said carefully. He said he was afraid of horses. He was. He learned. Silas looked at the boy. Noah kept his eyes on his bowl. How? Silas asked. Noah glanced up. Kept getting close to them, he said. Started with the fence. Just stood next to it. Whose horses? The farm next to us. Before. He said before the way his mother said it, with weight. The farmer didn't mind. He said it was the right way. That you didn't make the horse come to you. You just stayed until you weren't a threat anymore. Silas was quiet. Smart farmer, he said. He was nice, Noah said. Then, after a pause, he moved away. Silas looked at his soup. Clara looked at nothing in particular. The kitchen held all of this. The before, the after, the not yet. Without comment, because that was what kitchens at midday did. They held things. The days shaped themselves into a pattern, the way days do when people share a roof long enough. Not by intention exactly, but by the logic of repeated necessity. Silas went out early. Noah followed when he was allowed. Clara managed the house by degrees, adding warmth to it the way you'd add warmth to a room with a fire that's been unlit a long time, slowly, from the inside out. She was not a romantic about it. She had enough actual problems to prevent romance about anything. But she noticed things. She noticed that the parlor at the front of the house had a chair in it that faced a window, and that the window faced east, and that the chair had a slight depression in it from years of use. She noticed that there were no photographs anywhere in the house. Not one, not on the mantel, not on the walls, which struck her as strange in a way she couldn't articulate. She noticed that Silas owned more books than the surveying manual, but kept them in a wooden crate in the corner of his room where they weren't visible from the doorway. She noticed that he was better with Noah than he thought he was. Not naturally. That wasn't it. He was not the kind of man who was easy with children in that instinctive way some people were. He held himself with a distance that was habitual, and that she suspected had calcified over years into something he no longer thought of as a choice. But with Noah, some edge of the distance went soft. He answered the boy's questions. He corrected him without sharpness when he did something wrong around the horses. He showed him things, where the water in the east pasture ran in spring, how to check a hoof properly, why you packed a repair kit a certain way so the tools you needed first were on top. Noah absorbed all of it and showed his absorption only by doing it correctly the next time. On the 9th evening, Clara found a worn deck of cards in the kitchen drawer. Do you play? She asked. Silas looked at the deck. Used to. Noah knows 2 games. Neither of them are real games. He made them up. Noah, at the end of the table, looked up with an expression of mild offense. They're real. They have rules you change when you're losing, Clara said. That's called adapting. Silas looked between them. Then he pulled out the chair across from Noah and sat down. He took the cards from Clara and shuffled them. Not elaborately, but with the ease of someone who'd done it many thousands of times, and dealt. What's the first game? He asked. Noah's invented game involved obscure rules about face cards and a scoring system that Clara had never fully understood and suspected Noah hadn't fully decided on. Silas listened to the explanation with the complete, unironic attention he gave to most things, asked 2 clarifying questions, and then proceeded to win 2 hands in a row by interpreting the rules in a way that was technically compliant with what Noah had described, but clearly not what Noah had intended. Noah stared at his cards. "That's not," he started. "You said the king counts double if the last card played was a heart," Silas said. "The last card played was a heart." "I meant my heart." "You didn't say that." Clara was watching Silas's face. There was something there, not teasing exactly, which would have been too light for his register, but something in the same neighborhood, something that knew it was doing something and was doing it on purpose. "Fine," Noah said. He gathered the cards. "We'll play the second game. I made this one more recently, so the rules are better." "By better," Clara said, "he means more complicated." "Complicated and better are sometimes the same thing," Noah said, with a dignity that Silas seemed to find either impressive or amusing, because something shifted at the corner of his mouth. They played for an hour. The lamp burned low, and Clara refilled it, and they played past the point where any of them were keeping proper track of the score, into the territory where the game was just an excuse to be at the same table. This was, Clara thought, what a house that was alive felt like. She'd forgotten. It had been long enough. She looked at Silas, at his hands dealing the cards, at the scars she'd stopped noticing because she'd grown accustomed to his face, and she thought, "I know who you are. You carried me. You didn't know me, and you carried me. What kind of man does that?" She thought she might be starting to understand what kind. It was Noah who found the drawings. Or rather, it was Noah who started making them, which was how Clara found out that the paper in the desk in the corner of the parlor had been there long enough to have yellowed slightly at the edges, and that Silas did not appear to know what to do about a child who sat quietly in his parlor, and drew. Noah drew the way he did most things, methodically, with reference to actual observation. He sat at the desk and drew the barn, first from memory, and then by moving the chair to where he could see out the window. He drew Ghost. He drew the east fence line as he remembered it from the repair trip, which was topographically inaccurate but expressively correct. He drew a house with 3 people outside it. Silas saw this one because Noah had left it on the table, and Silas came to look at it with the careful, slightly uncomfortable attention he gave to things he didn't entirely know what to do with. The 3 figures were crude in the way of children's drawings. Round heads, straight limbs, the body proportions approximate at best. But you could tell which one was Noah by the size, and you could tell which one was Clara by the braid. The third one was tall and stood slightly apart from the other 2, not behind them exactly, not quite separate either, not apart, just there. Silas looked at it for a long time. He didn't say anything. He went to the barn and came back 2 hours later smelling of horse and cold, and sat at the kitchen table while Clara made biscuits. She'd gotten flour from the list of things he'd brought back from a quick trip to town 2 days ago, in which she had not been invited to join and had not pushed to, and neither of them mentioned the drawing. But that evening, after Noah was in bed, Silas came to the kitchen and set something on the table in front of Clara. It was a small tin of colored pencils. Old, most of them worn down but real, red and blue and green and brown and yellow, all present. Clara looked at them. "He's been using that charcoal stick," Silas said. "It breaks." She looked up at him. He was already turning toward the hallway. "Silas," she said. He stopped. She didn't know what she'd been going to say. Something that would have been too much, or not enough, or the wrong shape for this kitchen, this lamp, this particular evening. She looked at the pencils. "Thank you," she said instead. He nodded once, which meant something in his register, and went to bed. Clara sat for a while after, alone, with the colored pencils in front of her and the lamp burning and the quiet of the house around her, said, not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of people sleeping, which is a completely different thing. She was thinking about the contract, about Voss, about the fact that better was not the same as safe, and that safe was still something she did not have. She was also thinking that she had not expected this, any of this, and that sometimes the things you don't expect are the ones that matter because you haven't prepared a defense against them. She was thinking that she was in trouble, not in the way of Voss and the contract and the men who would eventually find her, though that trouble was real enough. A different kind of trouble, the kind that comes from caring what happens to something outside yourself, from letting a place get inside you, from watching a man quietly buy a set of children's colored pencils and leave them on a table and say nothing. She had not planned for this. She had not planned for any of it. Outside, the wind moved across the valley, and the snow that had fallen all winter lay still and blue-white under a sky full of stars, and the lights in the windows of the Boone Ranch burned low and steady against the dark. It was the kind of quiet that asked something of you, the kind that had weight. Clara Hale put her hand over the tin of pencils, just briefly, the way you put your hand over something you want to hold without yet being sure you're allowed. Then she blew out the lamp and went to bed, and tried not to think about how temporary she'd promised herself this would be. They came on a Tuesday. Clara knew something was wrong before she saw them. She felt it the way you feel a change in weather, a pressure shift that had nothing to do with the actual air. She'd been in the yard hanging the washing on the line Silas had strung between two posts near the south wall, her fingers stiff with cold despite the gloves, when Ghost started moving in the paddock. Not panicking, just alert in the particular way horses got when they heard hoofbeats their owner hadn't made. She turned. There were two of them, riding in from the road at a pace that was not hurried but was deliberate. The pace of men who had somewhere specific to be and had been paid to get there. Both wore long coats, and both had the look of men employed for their willingness rather than their warmth. The one in front was heavy-set, with a beard that hadn't been tended in a few weeks. The one behind was younger, with a narrow face and eyes that moved around the property the way you'd case a place before you decided what to do with it. Clara did not run. Running was the wrong move, and she knew it. It confirmed things. It gave them something to use. She stood her ground by the washing line and watched them come, and her hands, which had been hanging a shirt, went still at her sides. Silas came out of the barn. He'd heard the horses, too. He stood in the barn doorway for a moment. She could see him doing the same assessment she'd done, and then he walked out into the yard. He had not brought anything with him. No rifle, no tool, nothing in his hands. He walked to a point roughly between Clara and the approaching riders and stopped there. The two men pulled up about 20 feet out. "We're looking for a woman," the heavy-set one said. His voice had the flat quality of someone reciting from a list. "Clara Hale. And a boy. You seen them?" "This is my property," Silas said. He said it without hostility and without particular welcome. Just a fact. "We know whose property it is, Boone." The man reached into his coat and produced a folded paper. "Got a legal summons here. Clara Hale is in breach of a labor contract. She's required to appear before the magistrate in Dalton County to answer the claim." He paused. "And the boy's to be remanded to the county children's home until the matter's settled." Silas did not look at Clara. He looked at the paper in the man's hand. "Let me see it," he said. The heavy-set man rode forward 2 steps and leaned down to offer it. Silas took it. He unfolded it and read it, and Clara watched him read it, and she watched his face, which told her almost nothing except that he was reading carefully, and that whatever he was thinking was not making it to the surface. He read it twice. Then he looked up at the two men. "This is signed by Magistrate Ord," he said. "That's right. Ord is in Dalton County." "Also right. We're in Crail County," Silas said. "Ord has no jurisdiction here. This paper is worth less than the paper it's printed on." The heavy-set man's expression shifted slightly. Not surprised that he'd probably anticipated this, but a recalculation. "Mr. Voss has the right to pursue this claim across county lines. The debt—" "There is no debt," Clara said. Both men looked at her. She hadn't meant to speak yet, but the word debt had come out of the man's mouth with such ease, as if it were an established fact rather than a fiction Voss had manufactured, and she could not let it sit there unchallenged. "There is a fraudulent contract," she said, "signed under misrepresentation. That's not a debt. That's a crime." The younger man in the back made a small sound that might have been a laugh. "Ma'am," the heavy-set one said, with the tone of a man being patient at considerable personal expense, "what you think about the contract and what the contract says are 2 different things. And right now the contract says you owe Harlan Voss." Silas tore the paper. Not dramatically, not with anger. He simply folded it in half once more, gripped both halves, and tore it cleanly. Then he folded those halves and tore again. He did this 4 times until the summons was in a dozen pieces, and he let the pieces fall from his hand into the snow at his boots. Both riders stared at him. The yard was very quiet. The only sound was Ghost moving along the paddock fence. You just destroyed a legal, the heavy-set man started. I just destroyed an illegal document on my property, Silas said. You came onto my land without permission. You've made demands of a person under my employ, and you've threatened a child. He looked from one man to the other with the particular quality of a man who is not angry, which is somehow more unsettling than a man who is. I'm going to ask you once to leave. The younger man's hand moved toward his coat. Don't, Silas said. He said it the way you said it to a dog that was about to do something it would regret. Not loudly, not with warning, just with the flat certainty of someone who has already decided what happens next. The younger man's hand stopped. The heavy-set rider looked at Silas for a long moment. He was doing another calculation. Clara could see it. The weighing of variables, the assessment of a situation that had not gone the way the morning was supposed to go. Silas Boone did not look like a man who was bluffing. He did not, in fact, look like a man who was feeling anything strongly enough to bluff about it. He just looked like a man who had made a decision and was waiting for other people to catch up to it. Voss won't let this go, the heavy-set man said. It was less a threat than a statement of the world as it was. I know, Silas said. Go tell him that. Another moment. Then the heavy-set man turned his horse, and the younger one followed, and they rode back down the road without hurrying, which was somehow worse than if they'd left fast. Clara stood at the washing line until they were out of sight. Then she sat down on the stump that Silas used as a splitting block, because her legs had decided they were done holding her up for the moment, and she pressed her hands flat on her knees and breathed. Silas walked over to where the pieces of the summons lay in the snow. He crouched and picked them up, all of them, with the methodical care of a man who cleaned up what he'd made, and held them in one closed fist. Are you all right? He asked. Fine, she said, which was not entirely accurate. Where's Noah? Still inside. He didn't come out. He paused. Which means he probably looked out the window. Clara closed her eyes briefly. How much did he see? Enough. She opened her eyes. She looked at Silas, who was still crouching, still holding the pieces of paper in his fist, and she thought about what he'd just done. Not the tearing, which was bold but manageable, but what came before it. The way he'd walked out of the barn and placed himself between her and the riders without asking permission, without deliberation, as naturally as you'd step between a child and something dangerous. You didn't have to do that, she said. I know. They'll go back to Voss. Yes. And Voss will send more, possibly someone with proper papers this time, proper jurisdiction. Probably. She looked at her hands on her knees. Silas, I need to... She stopped, started again. I can't have you in the middle of this. You've already done more than... Clara. He said her name in the way he said most things, not gently, not harshly, just clearly, as if clarity were the highest form of respect he knew how to offer. Stop. She looked up at him. He stood from his crouch. He opened his fist and looked at the torn pieces for a moment, then put them in his coat pocket. I'm going to town, he said. Now? Tomorrow, early. He looked toward the barn, then back at her. There are things I need to find out. About the contract. About Voss's claims and where they actually stand legally, not where he says they stand. He paused. You have the original document? Your copy? She had carried it for months, folded into the lining of her coat in an inside pocket she'd sewn herself, because she'd understood from the beginning that the paper was the thing, that losing the paper would mean losing the ability to prove what was in it. Yes, she said. I'll need to look at it tonight. She nodded. He turned toward the house, and she understood she was being included in the turn, invited to follow. She got up off the stump and walked beside him, and neither of them said anything else. Inside, Noah was at the kitchen table with his colored pencils and a sheet of paper, drawing something she couldn't see from the door. He looked up when they came in. His eyes moved to Silas and then to his mother with the quick, assessing look of a child who has learned to read rooms for information. Who were those men? He asked. Men from Dalton County? Clara said. It's handled. Noah looked at her for a moment with an expression that was too old for his face. The expression of a child who has heard it's handled enough times to know that what it really means is I don't want you to be afraid yet. Was it about Voss? He asked. Clara looked at him. Yes. Are they coming back? She sat down across from him. She had promised herself after Edgar died that she would not lie to her son about things that mattered. She had failed this promise twice and regretted it both times. Maybe, she said, we're going to deal with it. Noah looked at Silas, who was standing near the door pulling off his coat. You're going to help? Noah asked him. Silas hung his coat on the hook. He didn't look at the boy when he answered, but he answered. Yes, he said. Noah looked down at his drawing. He picked up the brown pencil and added something to it. A deliberate stroke, a small addition. Clara leaned slightly to see what he'd been drawing. It was the yard, the washing line. 2 figures standing close together, and 2 figures on horses riding away. The riders on horses were small, getting smaller. That night, after Noah was asleep, Clara spread the contract on the kitchen table. It was 4 pages, handwritten in the cramped legal script that Voss's man had used. His own man, not an actual lawyer, though it was close enough to lawyer language to be dangerous. She'd read it so many times that she'd memorized most of it, but she watched Silas read it now with fresh eyes, going slowly the way he did everything, and she tried to see it through him. He read all 4 pages twice. He turned back to the 2nd page and read a section again. He turned to the 3rd. Here, he said, putting his finger on a clause near the bottom of the 3rd page. She leaned in. She knew which clause. The penalty provision, she said. It sets damages at a fixed rate regardless of time served. He looked up at her. That's not standard. Most contracts like this, labor contracts, even the dubious ones, prorate the damages based on how much of the term you've completed. This one doesn't. It sets a flat number. I noticed that. Which means if you left 1 day in or 2 years in, you'd owe the same amount. Which also means it was never designed to be satisfied, Clara said. It was designed to be held over a person indefinitely. Silas was quiet, looking at the page. How many other women? He said. I know of 3. There may be more. She folded her arms against the cold that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. One of them is still there. She's been there 4 years. He looked at the contract for another moment. Then he set it aside and found a blank piece of paper from the same desk Noah had been raiding, and a pencil, and he started writing. Not fast, but steadily. What are you doing? She asked. Making notes. He wrote for a while. If this goes before a real judge, not Ord, but an actual territorial court, this clause alone is enough to challenge the whole contract. Courts don't like provisions that create perpetual liability. It suggests coercion. He paused. It suggests coercion because it is coercion. I know that, Clara said. What you need is someone to say it who wears a robe and sits behind a bench. He kept writing. That's the difference. She watched his hand move across the paper. It was a careful hand she'd noticed, precise in a way that didn't quite match the roughness of the rest of him, like a quality that had been cultivated separately. Silas, she said. What happened in Merritt Crossing? After. He kept writing. She thought he wasn't going to answer. I told you, I went north. You had scars, all across your chest, your neck, not just... She gestured toward her own jaw. A lot more than this. Yes. And you came up here and built a house and didn't talk to anyone. He put the pencil down. He looked at the table rather than at her. My wife died, he said, while I was recovering from the fire. Fever. He said it plainly, the way you said something you'd made yourself be plain about through long practice. We'd been married 3 years. She was... He stopped. The house was already half built. I finished it because I didn't know what else to do with the time. Clara was quiet. I'm sorry, she said. It was 11 years ago. Time doesn't really change what it is. He looked at her then. A long look, the kind he didn't often give. Direct, and with something in it that was not quite surprised, but was something adjacent to surprised. No, he said, it doesn't. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked down at the contract, at his notes beside it. What are you planning? She asked. Going to town tomorrow, he said. Like I said, but not to ask questions. He picked up the pencil again. The flat damages amount? I counted it. It's a number I can cover. She stared at him. Silas, not what you think, he said. I'm not paying Voss. I'm going to the courthouse. paying the claimed amount into the court registry as a legal tender which forces the magistrate, the real one, the one in Crail County, to accept it as settlement of the claimed debt. Once the debt is settled, the contract is void. It can't be held over you anymore. Clara blinked. Can you do that? It's legal. It's not common, but it's legal. I looked it up. He said I looked it up in a way that suggested this had happened recently, like possibly last week, which meant he'd been thinking about this longer than last Tuesday. She felt something shift in her chest that she was not going to examine closely right now. That's a lot of money, she said. I have it. Silas, that's not... She tried to find the words that meant what she needed them to mean. That's your money. You don't owe me anything. I know what I already did, he said. I'm telling you what I'm going to do next. Why? He turned the pencil in his fingers. Once. He set it down. Because Voss has done this to other women, he said. Because that contract is a weapon, and he's going to keep using it. And because... He stopped. He looked at the window where the dark outside was complete and cold and absolute. Because your boy drew a picture today with two men on horses getting smaller, and I think that means something to him. I think he needs it to mean something real. Clara did not trust herself to speak for a moment. It's a lot of money, she said again, but differently this time. I'll need something in return, he said. She looked up sharply. He was already reaching into the desk drawer. She hadn't even noticed him open it. And he produced another piece of paper, this one official-looking, pre-printed with lines and fields. He set it on the table between them. An employment contract, he said. Legal, filed with the county, for ranch accounting and household management. He paused. The ranch accounts are a mess. Old Marty will tell you. I'm bad at it, and I know I'm bad at it. He looked at her. It gives you legal standing as an employee of the Boone Ranch. Voss can't claim you're a vagrant or an escaped debtor. You have a position and an address and a county record. Clara looked at the paper. And Noah? She said. Noah is your son. He goes where you go. Silas leaned back. The contract is real. The work is real. I'm not... He seemed to search for the right word. It's not charity. I know, she said. I'm not... Silas, she said quietly. I know. He nodded. He pushed the paper toward her. She picked up the pencil he'd set down and signed it. He left before dawn. Clara heard him in the kitchen, heard the stove, the coffee, boots on the floor. And she lay still in the spare room and listened to the sounds of a man preparing to go somewhere and made herself stay in bed rather than get up. Because getting up would mean going to the kitchen, and going to the kitchen would mean being there when he left. And something about that felt like more than she could navigate at present. She heard the door. She heard ghosts' hooves on the frozen ground, moving away. She got up then. She made coffee and stood at the kitchen window and watched the road, which was empty, and drank the coffee, which was better than what she'd made the first morning. Noah woke up an hour later and came to the kitchen still half asleep, hair standing up on one side from the pillow. Where's Silas? He asked. Town, she said. Noah looked at the chair that was Silas's chair. When's he back? I don't know. This evening, maybe. Tomorrow. Noah sat down. He pulled the closest pencil toward him. Habit, the same way some people needed something in their hands in the morning, and turned it around in his fingers. Are the men coming back? He asked. I don't know, Clara said. She looked at her son. Silas is going to try to make sure they don't have a reason to. Noah turned the pencil. He doesn't have to do that. No. But he's doing it anyway. Yes. Noah considered this with the long, slow consideration of a child who has learned that adults doing things they don't have to do is not something to be taken for granted. He's like that, Noah said. Like what? Noah frowned. He doesn't say things, but then he does them. He paused. Papa used to say things and then do them. Silas just does them. Clara looked at her son. She thought about Edgar, about the way he'd announce intentions, big and warm and filling the room with good feeling, and how she'd loved him for it, and how sometimes the announcement had been the thing and the doing had come slower or smaller, or not at all, and how that was not a condemnation because he'd had other qualities, good ones, and she had loved him completely. She thought about how grief was complicated and how it was not a scale and how you did not betray a person by noticing that someone else was different from them. She thought, my son sees things clearly. Yes, she said. He's like that. They came back at midday. Not Voss's men. Different men. 3 of them, with a county deputy's badge on the one in front, and papers that were, this time, properly filed and correctly jurisdicted and signed by the right magistrate. The deputy's name was Cowboy, and he was not unkind about it. He'd clearly done the kind of errand before that he didn't enjoy, and he explained the situation to Clara at the door in the level, factual tone of a man who was doing a job and had made peace with the job not always being pleasant. The summons required her appearance in Dalton County Court in 4 days. Failure to appear would result in a warrant for her arrest and immediate remand of the minor child. Noah stood at the kitchen door and listened. Clara took the papers. She thanked the deputy, which startled him slightly. She closed the door. She stood in the hallway for a moment, looking at the papers in her hand. Then she folded them very carefully, not tearing them because these ones were real, and set them on the kitchen table. She looked at her son. "It's all right," she said. "You said that before." "I know. Is it actually all right, or are you just saying it?" She looked at him steadily. "I think it's going to be all right. There's a difference." Noah looked at the papers on the table. When Silas gets back, we'll tell him and we'll figure out what to do," Clara said. "Okay?" Noah was quiet for a beat. "Okay." He went back to the parlor. She heard him pick up the pencils. She sat at the kitchen table and stared at the summons and tried to calculate odds, and found that she didn't have enough information to calculate anything, which was its own kind of answer. Marchant. Silas came back 2 hours before dark. She heard Ghost on the road and was in the barn doorway. Not waiting, she told herself, she was checking on the horses, which was something she'd been doing lately because the physical routine of it was steadying when he rode in. He looked tired. Not broken tired, just the ordinary tired of a long day and a cold ride. He dismounted and began unsaddling with the automatic movements of a man who had done this enough times that his hands knew what to do without his full attention. "Well," Clara said. He pulled the saddle. "It's done." She felt something release in her chest. "The registry? Accepted, filed. The contract debt is cleared as of today." He carried the saddle to the rack. "I also spoke to a lawyer, a real one, not Ord's cousin or whoever Voss has been using. Name's Fellows. He's in Crail County and He paused. "He's seen Voss's contracts before. He was not pleasant about them." "You hired him." "He agreed to represent you. I paid the retainer." He came back for the bridle. "Don't." "Don't what?" "Whatever you were going to say." She had been going to say, "You can't keep doing this." She closed her mouth. "Silas," she said instead. "They came back." He went still. He looked at her over Ghost's back. "Different men," she said. "A county deputy. Proper papers. I have to appear in Dalton County Court in 4 days." He was quiet. She watched him think. "Fellows," he said, "I'll send a telegram tomorrow. He'll appear with you." He turned back to the horse. "It's better, actually. Better to have this in front of a real court than manage through whatever Voss has been doing with Ord. 4 days is fast." "I know." He led Ghost toward the stall. "I'll take you. You and Noah. We'll stay in town the night before." She followed him into the barn. It was warmer in here than outside. The horses' heat, the closed space, the smell of hay and leather, and the particular dry smell of old wood that had absorbed winters for a long time. "Silas," she said. "Clara." He said it without turning around. "Why are you doing this?" He latched the stall. He stood with his back to her for a moment. "I told you." "The accounts are a reason," she said. "The employment contract. That's a reason. This," she gestured broadly at nothing specific. "Going to the courthouse, paying the retainer, paying the debt." She paused. "Riding into town alone in the cold when you've spent 11 years not talking to anyone. That's something else." He turned around. He leaned against the stall door and looked at her, and she looked back and the barn was quiet around them. The horses shifting, the small sounds of an old building settling, the wind finding the gaps. "Some debts deserve to be erased," he said. "That's not an answer." Some lives deserve another beginning. He said it differently than she expected. Not formally, not like a speech, but like something he'd been turning over long enough that it had worn smooth. I don't know how else to say it. She held his gaze. She thought about a 17-year-old girl running toward a burning building because she was the only one close enough. She thought about a man who'd built a house and then stopped living in it. She thought about a boy drawing pictures of horses he'd been afraid of, penciling figures of 3 people standing under one roof. Say it or don't, she said, but don't stand there and tell me it's about the accounts. Something happened in his face. Not much. A small, careful loosening. It's not about the accounts, he said. She nodded. I know, she said. She turned and walked back to the house, and she did not look back. And she was fairly certain that this was the right thing to do because some conversations needed to end at the right moment rather than at the natural one. And she had learned enough about Silas Boone to know that he would think better in silence, and that what he thought would matter. She went inside. She started dinner. Noah appeared from the parlor and set the table without being asked. 20 minutes later, Silas came in from the cold and hung up his coat and sat in his chair. And the kitchen was warm, and none of them said anything that needed saying out loud. Outside, the afternoon had gone the color of steel, and the wind was picking up from the northwest, and the snow that was coming could be felt in the air before it arrived. That particular pressure, that particular held-breath quality the sky got when it had made up its mind. But in the Boone Ranch kitchen, the lamp was lit and dinner was on the stove, and the boy was drawing at one end of the table while the man sat at the other end looking at papers without really reading them. And the woman stood at the stove and thought about 4 days in a courtroom and a lawyer named Fellows and whether any of it would be enough. She thought it might be. She thought there was a difference between might be and is, and that for now might be would have to do, and that she had survived on less. The snow started just after dark, soft and steady and without ceremony, covering the yard and the road and the fence line and the washing she'd forgotten to bring in, covering everything that had happened and everything that was still coming in a layer of white, that was, by morning, deep enough that you had to look carefully to see where the road ended and the fields began. But the lights in the windows of the Boone Ranch stayed on, and that, for the moment, was enough. The road to Dalton County took the better part of a day. They left before first light, the 3 of them in the wagon with blankets across their laps and a box of provisions Clara had packed the night before, with the quiet efficiency of someone who needed to be doing something with their hands. Noah sat between them on the bench, which was a practical arrangement given the cold, though Clara noticed he didn't seem to mind the practicality of it. He'd been up before either of them, dressed and at the table with his pencils before she'd even started the stove, drawing something he'd folded and put in his coat pocket when he saw her looking. Silas drove. He drove the way he did most things, without waste, without fuss, reading the road the way you read a long, familiar text. The country opened up around them as the sky lightened, gray giving way to the pale silver blue of a winter dawn. The land flat and wide and covered in last night's snow that hadn't drifted much because the wind had laid down. It was, Clara thought, the kind of morning that would have been beautiful if she hadn't been sitting in a wagon going to a courthouse. Fellows will meet us at the inn, Silas said around mid-morning. He sent a telegram yesterday afternoon. He's already spoken to the court clerk. What did he say? Clara asked. That Voss has filed the contract as evidence of debt, that the court will hear it. He paused. And that the fact that the debt has been settled through the county registry complicates Voss's claim considerably. Complicates, Clara said. Fellows is a careful man with words, Silas said. I think he means it collapses it. He was being a lawyer about it. Noah was looking out at the passing country. What if the judge doesn't care about the registry? He asked. Silas glanced at him. Then we have the contract itself. And Fellows knows how to read a contract to a judge in a way that makes what it's doing impossible to ignore. And if that doesn't work either? Noah, Clara started. He's asking the right question, Silas said. He looked at the road. If none of it works, we appeal to the territorial court, which takes longer and costs more, but which is also further from Voss's reach. He was quiet for a beat. But I think it's going to work. Noah considered this. You don't say things like that usually, he said. Like what? That you think something's going to be okay. Noah looked up at him. You usually just say what's happening. Silas kept his eyes on the road. "I think it's going to be okay," he said again, which was not a deflection but a deliberate repetition, and Clara felt it land the way it was meant to. Fellows was a short man with a surprisingly large presence, the kind of lawyer who had learned that a courtroom is a theater and had dressed accordingly in a coat that was one notch too formal for Dalton County, but which communicated precisely what it was meant to communicate. He met them in the lobby of the inn with a handshake for Silas, a careful assessment of Clara, and a look at Noah that softened whatever he'd been about to say professionally. "You're the boy," he said to Noah, not unkindly. "Yes, sir," Noah said. "You don't need to be in the courtroom," Fellows said. "In fact, I'd prefer you weren't. Judges don't like it when children are visibly present during proceedings about their own custody. It feels like pressure. Is there somewhere he can wait?" Clara looked at Silas. Silas looked at the innkeeper. "My wife can watch him," the innkeeper offered, without being asked, which surprised Clara and which she filed away. Noah looked between his mother and Silas with the expression of a child who knew that arguing would be both pointless and wrong, but who was reserving the right to have opinions about it. "I'll be right outside," Clara told him. "I know," Noah said. "Fellows will be in there." "I know. And Silas, Mama." He said it patiently, with the patience of someone who has heard reassurances enough times to understand them for what they are. "I know. Go." Done. The Dalton County courtroom was a single large room in a building that was also the land office and the tax collection office, and on Fridays, apparently the venue for some kind of community lecture series based on the notices pinned beside the door. It smelled of old wood and tobacco, and the particular institutional smell of rooms where unpleasant things happened and were recorded and filed. Magistrate Howell was not what Clara had expected, which was a man like Ord, comfortable, managed, belonging to whoever had paid for his comfort. Howell was older, with a judge's permanent squint from years of reading documents in poor light, and he had the particular impatience of a man who had seen too many cases that wasted his time to be anything but direct about the ones that didn't need to be complicated. Voss was not present. He'd sent a lawyer, but a man named Price, who wore an expensive coat and had the smooth, untroubled face of someone who charged by the hour and had excellent reasons to prolong things. Price presented the contract first. He laid it out clearly and not without skill. The terms of the agreement, the breach, the claimed damages, the precedent of the bond securing the child's custody as collateral against the debt. He was professional, and Clara could see, watching Howell's face, that the judge was listening with the focused attention of a man who was going to reach a conclusion and wanted to reach the right one. Then Fellows stood up. He was quiet for a moment before he started. Clara had noticed he did this, took a pause, let the room settle, and she understood it was intentional. "Your Honor," Fellows said, "the debt claimed in this contract was settled in full through the Crail County Court Registry 4 days ago. I have the filing here." He produced it. "The claimed amount, to the penny, has been tendered and accepted. Under territorial statute, accepted tender of a claimed debt extinguishes the debt. There is no longer a debt. There is therefore no breach. And without a breach, there is no basis for the custody provision to be invoked." Price was on his feet. "The settlement was made without the consent of the creditor. The statute does not require the creditor's consent," Fellows said, without raising his voice. "It requires accepted tender. The registry accepted it. That's the law." Howell looked at the filing. He looked at Price. "Is the tender recorded?" he asked. "Yes, Your Honor," Fellows said. "Stamped and dated." Howell looked at Price with the expression of a man who has heard what he needed to hear and is now performing the formality of letting the other side finish. Price argued for another 15 minutes. He was skilled, and he found angles that Clara hadn't anticipated. He tried the argument that the tender had been made by a third party and therefore constituted an improper substitution of debtor, which Fellows answered by citing 3 separate cases in which the territorial court had explicitly allowed third-party tender. He tried the argument that the contract contained additional conditions beyond the debt itself, which Fellows answered by reading the contract's own language back to him, specifically the provision that clearly stated that full settlement of the claim damages would render all other provisions void, At one point, Howell interrupted both of them to ask a direct question about the flat damages clause. The provision Claire had spent months staring at, the one that set the same penalty whether you'd worked 1 day or 3 years. Is that standard? Howell asked Price. Price said that it was within the terms of contract law. Howell looked at him for a long moment. That's not what I asked. Price said nothing useful. Fellows, when given the opportunity, said quietly that, in his experience and in the experience of the territorial court precedents he'd reviewed, a fixed, non-prorated damages clause in a labor contract created conditions that made genuine breach practically impossible to avoid, that it was, in effect, an instrument of permanent liability rather than a legitimate contractual remedy. Howell looked at the contract. He turned to the second page. He turned to the third. He looked up. The claim is dismissed, he said. The debt is settled. The custody provision is without basis and is stricken. The contract is rendered void in its entirety. He looked at Price. You'll want to inform your client. Price gathered his papers with the controlled composure of a man who was already thinking about his next move. He did not look at Clara. Outside in the corridor, Clara sat on the bench across from the innkeeper's wife, who had been teaching Noah a card game he seemed to be winning, and she heard the door open and she looked up and Fellows came out first with his careful professional face doing something that was almost warmth, and Silas came out behind him. He looked at her. She stood up. He nodded once. She sat back down, because her legs had done this before and she recognized the feeling. The innkeeper's wife looked at her with a kind of knowing that needed no explanation. Noah looked from his mother to Silas. Well, he said. It's done, Silas said. Noah looked at his cards. He put them down on the bench very deliberately, as if completing a task. Then he looked at the wall across the corridor for a moment in a way that was trying very hard not to be emotional about anything, because he was 9 years old and did not cry in corridors, apparently. Okay, he said. They stayed the night and drove back the next morning, and the road that had felt long going was shorter, coming back in the way that roads are when the thing you were going toward is behind you. Clara noticed, about an hour from home, that the light was different, not the light in the sky. That was the same flat winter white. But something about the way the land looked as they came down off the county road and turned onto the road that ran past Silas's property. She noticed it and couldn't identify it for a while, and then she understood. She was looking at it like it was somewhere she was going rather than somewhere she'd ended up. That was the difference. That was what had changed. She did not say this out loud. Spring came the way Wyoming springs came, reluctantly, argumentatively, with false starts and setbacks, and one last hard freeze in early April that killed the crocuses she'd planted along the south wall of the house and caused her to say things in the garden that she wouldn't have said with Noah in earshot. But it came. The snow pulled back from the pastures by degrees, revealing the brown and matte-flattened grass underneath that was, within 2 weeks, showing green at the roots. The cottonwoods along the creek began to show the faint yellow-green haze of leaves considering their options. The mornings lost their edge. The horses spent more time at the fence, heads up, reading the air. Marty came back. His wrist had healed, or healed well enough. He said the doctor in Laramie had told him it would never be quite right, that there was a bone in there that had knit crookedly. But Marty had the attitude toward physical imperfection that most men who'd spent 40 years working ranches developed, which was that the body was a tool and tools had history. He arrived on a Tuesday with a pack mule and a pipe, and a detailed opinion about what had happened to the east fence line in his absence. He looked at Clara when Silas introduced them. He looked at Noah when Noah came around from the paddock. He looked at the house, which was different in ways he couldn't immediately catalog, warmer, somehow, rearranged in its small furnishings and its smells. A garden started along the south wall, and a washing line that had laundry on it that was not Silas's. He looked back at Silas. "Well," Marty said. "Don't," Silas said. "I wasn't going to say anything." "You were about to say something." "I was going to say, well, that's all." He knocked the pipe against his boot. "Well," he shook Clara's hand with the formality of a man who respected people by not making things complicated. He looked at Noah. "You ride?" "Getting better," Noah said. Marty picked up his pack. "Better is fine. Better's what everybody starts with. He looked at Silas. East fence. Fixed it in February. I'll check it anyway. I knew you'd say that. Then why'd you bother telling me you fixed it? He went to the barn, and that was Marty's introduction to the new arrangement of things, which he appeared to accept with the philosophical flexibility of a man who had worked for Silas long enough to understand that Silas did not do things accidentally. The accounts, as it turned out, were exactly the mess Silas had said they were. Clara spent 3 days just understanding the system, or the absence of system, in which Silas had been recording the ranch's finances. He was not careless, exactly. He tracked things, but he tracked them in 4 different places, in a notation that was half standard and half invented, with a method for categorizing expenses that appeared to have evolved organically rather than by design, and which meant that finding the actual state of the ranch's finances required cross-referencing 3 ledgers and a handful of loose papers that lived in the desk drawer in no discernible order. She sorted it. She built a single ledger and transferred everything into it, and then checked it twice. Then she sat down with Silas at the kitchen table and showed him what she'd found. "You're not as far behind as I thought," she said. He looked at the numbers. "That's better than I expected you to say. You've been careful with the cattle sales. The horse sales are inconsistent, but they've covered gaps." She ran her finger down the column. "The fence repairs this winter cost more than they should have because you were buying materials in Black Ridge, which charges more than the supplier in Milford. Milford is an extra 2 hours. The difference in price over a year saves you more than the time costs you." He looked at her finger on the ledger. "You've done this before," he said. "For 4 years," she said. "My husband worked the mine. I kept the books for the company store on the same property. The owner was—" She paused. He was not careful with money either, but he liked his numbers to be right. "What happened to him?" "He sold to a larger company and moved to Denver." She straightened up. "He gave me a reference letter, actually. It's in my coat. I forgot I had it until last week." Silas looked at her with the expression of a man recalibrating. "You could have used that in Black Ridge," he said. "I was sick in Black Ridge," she said. He looked back at the ledger. "The Milford supplier. Is the quality the same?" "I'd need to check, but based on what Marty says about the last batch of wire from Black Ridge, probably better." He was quiet, running his eyes down the numbers she'd organized. "All right," he said. "That's it? All right? What else would you like me to say?" Most men who've been doing things wrong for years take at least a few minutes to disagree about it before they accept the correction. He looked at her. Most men have more pride than sense about their accounting. "You don't?" "I have no pride about accounting. I know I'm bad at it. That's why I wanted someone who wasn't." She looked at him. There was something almost funny about this, about the particular straightforwardness of it, and she felt the smile reach her face before she decided to let it. "Fair enough," she said. He looked at the smile in the way he looked at things he was deciding what to do with. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. He looked back at the ledger, and she let it go, and they spent another hour going through the cattle records, which was where most of the real money moved, and by the end of it, she understood the ranch's finances well enough to manage them, and he understood them well enough to trust her to. It was in this way that March became April, and April became May, and the ranch became, in ways that happened incrementally and without announcement, something different from what it had been. Noah grew, not just in the obvious physical sense, though he grew in that too, enough that by April the boots he'd arrived in no longer fit, and Silas had driven him to Black Ridge without particular fanfare and come back with new ones that were slightly too large, but which, as Silas observed, he'd grow into. He grew in the way that children grow when they are given something stable to grow against. He was less watchful, less conserving. He laughed more, and the laughing was looser, less like something he decided to do, and more like something that happened to him. He became, over the course of those weeks, genuinely competent around horses. Not expert. He was 9, and expertise was a long project, but reliable. Marty, who distributed praise the way a bank distributed loans, carefully and with extensive review, told Clara at the end of April that the boy had good hands and better instincts, and that Ghost, who in Marty's 30 years of working with horses was the most selectively attached animal he'd encountered, would take feed from the boy's hand, which was not nothing. "That horse doesn't do that," Marty said. "I know," Clara said. Took me 6 months before he'd let me near him without flattening his ears. I know. Marty looked at the paddock, where Noah was brushing Ghost's flank with the slow, even stroke Silas had shown him, talking to the horse in the low, continuous murmur he'd developed for the purpose. The boy talks to him like he's got opinions, Marty said. He does, Clara said. Horse does have opinions, Marty conceded. They're mostly wrong, but they're definite. No, the afternoon in mid-May that changed the geometry of things happened without warning, the way most important things do. Silas had been repairing the north gate, a project that had been deferred since fall and which was now urgent because the spring thaw had settled the posts at an angle that made the gate drag in the mud. He'd been at it since morning, and he was almost done when the wood split on him. Not the gate itself. One of the support posts, old dry wood that the freeze-thaw cycles had worked on for years, and which chose this moment to give up along a crack that ran grain deep. The split took the post sideways and took Silas's hand with it, catching the edge of his palm against the exposed nail he'd been working around. It was not a serious wound, he'd had far worse, but it was deep enough to bleed thoroughly, and he was out at the north gate alone and his bandana was inadequate, and by the time he got back to the house, he'd left a trail across the yard that Noah saw from the paddock and reacted to by running for Clara at a pace that suggested the wound was worse than it was. Clara was in the kitchen with the ledger. She heard Noah come in fast and she was already standing when he appeared in the doorway. He cut his hand, Noah said, on the gate. It's bleeding. She was past him and out the door before she'd made a conscious decision. Silas was at the yard pump, running water over his hand with the expression of a man who was annoyed at himself rather than distressed about the injury. He looked up when she appeared. It's not, he started. Let me see it, she said. It's fine, Clara. Let me see it. He held out his hand. She looked at it. The cut ran diagonally across the heel of his palm, not deep enough to need stitching, but deep enough to need more than a bandana. She held his hand without thinking about the fact that she was holding his hand because the wound was what required attention, and she was good at attending to things that required it. Come inside, she said. I need to finish the gate. The gate will wait an hour. She was already walking. He followed, which she suspected was partly because she had, without intending to, not let go of his wrist. She let go of his wrist at the kitchen door. She got the clean cloth and the iodine and the bandaging she'd organized in the kitchen cabinet because this was a ranch, and people got cut on ranches, and she'd seen no reason not to be prepared. She made him sit at the table. He sat. He looked at the iodine with the expression of a man who has made peace with iodine, but not made friends with it. She worked. She cleaned the wound, and he made no sound about the iodine, which she noted. She bandaged his hand with the competence of someone who had done field doctoring on a mining property where small injuries happen daily. Noah stood in the kitchen doorway, watching with the focused expression of a child who was filing information. Is he going to be all right? Noah asked. It's a cut, Clara said. He's fine. It bled a lot. Hands bleed a lot. There are a lot of veins. She tied off the bandaging. He'll need to keep it dry for a couple of days. I can't keep it dry, Silas said. I have a gate to finish. Marty can finish the gate. Marty's rigging the east. Marty can do the gate tomorrow, Clara said. She looked at him directly. You know I'm right. He looked at her. I know you think you're right, he said. That's the same thing, Noah said from the doorway. Silas looked at the boy. The boy had the carefully neutral expression of someone who had said a thing and was prepared to stand behind it. Is it? Silas said. Usually, Noah said. With Mama, mostly. Clara looked at her son with an expression that she tried to make warning and which she suspected contained more amusement than was useful. Silas looked at his bandaged hand. He turned it over, looking at the wrapping. You did this on a mine property, he said. 4 years of it. You know about a lot of things, he said. He said it in a way that was not quite a statement and not quite an observation, more like something he was confirming for himself, putting alongside other things he knew. I've had to, she said. He looked up at her. She was still close, closer than the kitchen usually required, which had to do with the wound and the lighting and the angle at which you needed to work to bandage a hand properly. She didn't move back. He didn't move. Clara, he said. Silas, she said. Noah appeared to find something extremely interesting about the kitchen doorframe at this moment. Silas looked at his hand and then at her. "The dinner's burning," he said. She turned. The pot on the stove was not burning. It was doing the low simmer she'd set it to. But she went to it anyway, because the moment had reached its natural end, and anything she said now would be either too much or not enough. "It's fine," she said, to the pot. "I know," he said, to something that was not quite the pot. It was a week after this that Silas did the thing Clara had not expected, and which, in retrospect, she understood had been coming for longer than a week. She was in the garden, the south wall garden that she'd started in March, replanting the crocuses after the last freeze killed them, adding other things, practical things, herbs for the kitchen and onions, and whatever seeds she'd been able to afford from the Black Ridge store. It was not yet a real garden. It was more a statement of intent in dirt. But things were growing. She heard the screen door and looked up. Silas came out of the house with 2 cups of coffee and crossed the yard without ceremony and handed her one. She took it. They stood together at the edge of the garden and looked at what was coming up. "The onions are taking," she said. "They look it. I'm not sure about the carrots. The soil here is too rocky." "You can amend it," he said. "Add some of the old manure from the south pile." "I know. I was going to." "I know you were." She drank the coffee. It was better than what she made, somehow, though she'd been making it in the same pot with the same amount of grounds for 3 months. She had not figured out what she was doing differently. "Clara," he said. "Silas, I need to ask you something." She looked at him. He was looking at the garden. He had his left hand in his coat pocket, the bandaged hand, and the right hand around his cup, and he was looking at the onions with the particular attention of a man who is preparing to say something he has been practicing. "All right," she said. "I know this isn't—" He stopped, started differently. "I know that everything that's happened here has been because of circumstances that were difficult, and I'm not—" He stopped again. She waited. "I don't want you to feel that staying is the only reasonable choice. Because of the contract being settled, or because of Noah and the ranch, or because—" "Silas," she said. "Because it makes practical sense," he continued, "because when he decided to say a thing, he apparently saw it through. I want you to know that if you wanted to leave, go somewhere else. Take Noah and make something different. I would—" He looked at his coffee. "I would help with that. Also." Clara looked at this garden for a moment. "You're asking me if I want to leave," she said. "I'm telling you that I'd help you either way. That's not quite the same as asking." He looked at her. She met his eyes, which she had become more accustomed to. The gray of them. The distance in them that was not coldness, but the expression of a man who had taught himself to watch things from farther away than necessary. "Are you asking me to stay?" she said. The morning was very quiet. The garden, the south wall, the sky above the wall showing the particular hard blue of a Wyoming May morning. "Yes," he said. She looked at her coffee. She thought about what she'd thought months ago, about being in trouble of a certain kind, about caring what happened to something outside yourself, about letting a place get inside you. She thought about how she'd warned herself against it and gone ahead anyway, the way you always did with the things that mattered. She thought about Noah on the bench that morning, that first morning. She thought about colored pencils on a table. She thought about a hand held at a gate pump and a bandage tied and a man who said, "I know, you think you're right," to her argument, and she lives. That's enough to an empty road. She thought about the fact that she had not thought about leaving in 6 weeks. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. He nodded. He looked at the garden. "The carrots will probably be fine," he said. "The soil's better than it looks." "I'll amend it anyway," she said. "Suit yourself?" She drank her coffee. He drank his. The garden grew in the sun between them, impractical and determined and already further along than you'd think, given the rocky soil and the difficult spring and the fact that it had not been here at all, only months ago. Marty came around this corner of the barn at that moment, saw them both standing at the garden with their coffee, registered the situation with the comprehensive peripheral awareness of a man who had seen a great deal in 40 years, and turned around and went back around the barn without a word. Clara heard him start to whistle somewhere on the other side of the building, a tuneless, contented kind of whistle, the kind with no particular melody. Silas looked at the corner of the barn. "He's going to be impossible," he said. "He's already impossible," Clara said. "This won't change anything." "He's going to say well again. He'll say it differently this time." Silas almost smiled. She had become good at reading the almost in the months since the first morning at the kitchen table. It was its own kind of fluency, learning a person's almost. "Probably," he said. Noah appeared in the garden doorway, the gap in the south wall where Clara had taken down 2 boards to let more light in, with Ghost's lead rope in his hand and a look on his face that was trying to appear casual and was not quite succeeding. "Silas," he said, "Ghost won't walk straight. He keeps pulling toward the creek." Silas finished his coffee. He set the cup on the wall. "He does that in spring," he said. "There's something in the grass near the creek that he likes. You have to be firmer with him than you think you need to be." "How much firmer?" "Show him who's making the decision. Not rough, just clear." He looked at the boy. "You know how to be clear." Noah looked at the rope in his hand. He nodded, once, with the expression of someone filing this away with everything else. He went back through the garden gap. They heard him talking to the horse, that low, patient murmur, and then the sound of hooves moving, and then the sound moving away from the creek rather than toward it. Clara and Silas stood at the south wall of the Boone Ranch in the May morning and listened to her son handle a difficult horse in the pasture beyond. And the sound was ordinary in the way that only the best things become ordinary, through repetition and time and the slow accumulation of days that are not remarkable except in what they're building. Neither of them said anything else for a while. There was nothing that needed saying. The letter from Fellows arrived on a Thursday in late June, which was also the day the South Garden finally produced something worth eating. Clara found both at roughly the same time, the letter in the tin box at the end of the road where Silas had long ago nailed it to a post with the pragmatic indifference of a man who expected very little mail, and the first real tomatoes on the vine along the south wall, still small but genuinely red, the color of something that had decided to be what it was. She stood in the garden with the letter in one hand and a tomato in the other and read the letter first, because the letter was why she'd walked out to the road in the first place, and she was not the kind of person who lost track of the main thing. Fellows wrote the way he spoke, carefully, with the lawyer's habit of putting the most important information after sufficient context. She read through the context, then she reached the important information. Harlan Voss had withdrawn all remaining claims, not settled them, not deferred them. Withdrawn. The distinction mattered, and Fellows had been careful to make it. A settlement implied some continued negotiation of terms, some ongoing acknowledgement that there'd been a legitimate dispute. Withdrawal meant Voss had looked at what he had and decided he didn't want to put it in front of a territorial judge. The petition regarding Noah had been withdrawn first. Then 3 days later, everything else. The contract itself, the original, the only copy Voss had possessed, had been returned to Fellows' office by a courier who'd offered no explanation. There was a second page. It was not from Fellows. Clara turned to it. It was a letter from a woman named Margaret Calls, written in a hand that had the careful precision of someone who didn't write often and was trying very hard to be clear. Margaret Calls had been in Voss's household for 4 years. She was one of the women Clara had known about, one of the 3. She was writing to say that 2 weeks after Voss withdrew his claims against Clara Hale, he had also released her from her contract, that she was in Milford now, staying with her sister, that she'd heard about what happened in the Dalton County Court from the magistrate's clerk, who told her cousin, who told her, that she wanted Clara to know. "I don't know what you did or how you did it," Margaret Calls had written, "but whatever it was, it reached further than you know. I don't have a way to thank you properly, so I'm just writing to tell you that I got out. I thought you should know that too." Clara stood in the garden with the 2 pages and the tomato and felt something move through her that was not quite happiness. Happiness was too simple a word for it, but was related to happiness the way a river was related to rain, something that had accumulated from a long way off and arrived, finally, at a place it could be. She looked at the south wall of the house, at the window above the sink where she could see the kitchen, the lamp on the table, the ordinary, particular shape of a place she lived. She went inside. Silas was at the table with the cattle ledger when she came in. He'd been trying to reconcile 2 months of entries that she'd done in her system against the way he'd tracked things before, Not because he didn't trust her system, but because he was the kind of man who needed to understand the reasoning, not just the result. She'd watched him do this, spend time relearning things he didn't need to relearn, tracing her logic back to its beginning, and had decided it was one of the things she actually liked about him, the refusal to take anything on faith that could be taken on understanding. She set the letter on the table in front of him. He looked at her face before he looked at the letter. He read it, both pages. He read Margaret Calls's page twice, slower. Then he set it on the table and looked at it. Voss, he said, he withdrew everything. Everything. Including the contract. He sent the original back. Silas looked at the table. He was doing something with this information that she couldn't entirely read. She could see it processing, moving through him, but where it came out she wasn't sure yet. He knew he'd lose, Silas said. Fellows scared him. A fellows showed him what a territorial judge was going to say about a fixed penalty clause in a labor contract applied to a woman with no other options. He paused. Voss doesn't operate well in daylight. He's built everything on people not looking directly at what he does. And then you looked, Clara said. He glanced up. And then Fellows looked, he said. You hired Fellows. You signed his paperwork. She sat down across from him. Silas, we can share the credit. It's not a limited resource. Something shifted in his face. That almost, the one she'd learned to read. Margaret Calls, he said. He looked at the second page. She's out. She's in Milford, with her sister. That's good. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. There were 3, he said. I know. You said 3. Yes. He looked at her. What about the 3rd? Clara had been thinking about this since she'd read the letter at the garden wall. I don't know her name. I only knew what Margaret told me months ago, and she didn't know either. She'd only ever seen her from a distance. She paused. If Voss released Margaret, there's a chance. Fellows, Silas said. I was going to say the same thing. He pulled the cattle ledger aside and found a piece of paper and picked up the pencil. I'll write to him today, he said. See if the withdrawal was broad enough to include any other contracts he held in the same form. Clara watched him write the date at the top of the paper. You know, she said, most men who paid a lawyer to solve a problem would consider the problem solved when it was solved. It's not solved if there's someone else still in it. I know, she said. I know that's what you'd say. He looked up. Is that a criticism? He said. No, she said. It's one of the reasons. He looked at her with the expression of a man who was going to need a moment with that sentence. She got up and went back to the garden. Summer on the Boone Ranch had a different quality than winter, which was obvious but which Clara meant in a specific way. Winter had been about containment, about the enforced closeness of cold and 4 walls, about people learning each other in the compressed way that difficult seasons demanded. Summer was about extension. The work spread outward. The days were long and loud with insects and the smell of dry grass, and everyone moved more and talked less, not because things were worse, but because the world outside had opened up again and there was more of it to be in. Noah turned 10 in July. He announced this 3 weeks in advance, not because he wanted anything in particular. He was specific about this when Clara asked. He didn't need anything, he was just noting the date, but because he seemed to feel that the information should be on record, acknowledged, that it was the kind of thing worth flagging ahead of time rather than just arriving. Clara made a cake, which she had not made in over a year, and which she was reasonably sure she could still do. She used the last of the good sugar and some dried fruit she'd been saving without entirely knowing what she was saving it for, and she made it in the afternoon while Silas and Marty were out checking the summer pasture rotation. And when they came back, the kitchen smelled like something that stopped Marty in the doorway in a way that involved removing his hat, which he almost never did indoors. Birthday, Clara said. I can see that, Marty said. He put his hat back on. Boy's 10. As of this morning. Marty looked at the cake. Then he went to the barn and came back with something small, wrapped in an old cloth. A folding knife with a bone handle, the kind of knife a working ranch hand carried, sized for a younger hand. For the boy, he said. He set it on the table beside the cake and left quickly, in the manner of someone who has done something they don't want to discuss. Clara looked at the knife. Then, at the door, Marty had gone back out. She thought, this is what belonging looks like sometimes. Not grand. A folding knife on a kitchen table. A man who removes his hat. Silas gave Noah a different thing. He gave it after dinner, after the cake, which Noah ate 2 pieces of, and then looked at the remaining cake with the expression of someone exercising significant restraint. And after Marty had gone to the bunkhouse, and the evening had gone the color of copper out the kitchen windows, he went to the front room and came back with something that Clara hadn't seen before, which was a rolled piece of leather tied with a cord. He set it in front of Noah. Noah looked at him. "Open it," Silas said. Noah untied the cord and unrolled the leather. Inside was a folded document, older, the paper slightly yellowed, with the official stamp of the Territorial Land Office in the corner. Noah unfolded it carefully and looked at it. He looked at the numbers. He looked at Silas. "What is this?" he said. "The East Pasture," Silas said. "The 12 acres along the creek. I had it surveyed and registered in your name last month." He paused. "It's your land. It's not mine to work or sell. When you're grown, you decide what you do with it." Noah looked at the document for a long time. Clara, who had not known about this, looked at Silas, who was looking at the table with the careful expression of a man who has done something that matters to him and is not sure how it's going to land. "Why the East Pasture?" Noah asked. "It's where you like to be," Silas said. "The creek runs through it. The grass comes in good. Ghost likes it." He paused. "And you asked me back in February when we were fixing the fence whether I thought things could grow better along the East Ridge. I said probably. You remembered that I said probably." Noah looked at the paper. "I remember," he said. "So do I," Silas said. Noah folded the document back carefully and rolled the leather around it and tied the cord. He did this with the slow, deliberate care of someone handling something that now meant something permanent. Then he looked up at Silas with an expression that was trying very hard to be 9 going on 10 and not quite managing it. "Thank you," he said. Silas nodded once. "Don't thank me," he said. "Work it." Noah almost smiled. The almost was the same as his mother's. Fellows wrote back in August. The third woman's name was Ruth Deaver. She'd been in Voss's employ for 2.5 years under a contract substantially identical to Clara's. When Fellows contacted Voss's lawyer, a different one now, Price having apparently found other clients, he was informed that all labor contracts held by Harlan Voss had been terminated, and that Voss was no longer engaged in any business arrangement in the territory that required such instruments. Whether this was conscience or calculation, Clara would never know. She suspected calculation, that Voss had looked at the territorial court's increasing attention and decided the exposure wasn't worth the control it bought him. Men like Voss rarely changed because they understood they were wrong. They changed because the cost of being wrong rose high enough. Ruth Deaver had gone back to her family in Nebraska. Fellows had confirmed this through a contact. Clara read this letter alone at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning while Silas was in the far pasture and Noah was at his lessons. She'd set up a system in the spring of morning lessons at the kitchen table before the ranch work started, using the books Silas had in his wooden crate and 3 she'd ordered from the catalog, and Noah submitted to this with moderate grace, which was all she'd expected. She sat with the letter for a while after she finished it. 3 women, all out. The 4th was Clara herself, which meant the count was 4, and she'd known 2 of the 4, and the other 2 were strangers, and all 4 of them were somewhere other than Harlan Voss's household right now. She thought about what Margaret Calls had written. Whatever you did, it reached further than you know. She'd been carrying that sentence for weeks. She turned it over now, here at the kitchen table, in the ordinary light of an August morning. What she'd done, really, was collapse in Black Ridge. That was the actual beginning. She'd been sick and frightened and had run out of road, and a man she didn't remember saving had carried her somewhere warm. What came after? The contract, the court, the letter to Fellows. All of that was the consequence of being carried, of not being left in the street. She thought about what it meant that the whole structure had pivoted on that one moment, on Silas pulling on his reins and getting down from Ghost and walking to a bench in the snow, on the particular fact that he was the one who happened to ride by, that it wasn't nobody. People talked about fate when they meant this. when they meant the way one small hinge could bear the weight of everything. She had never put much stock in fate, because fate implied inevitability, and she'd seen too many versions of events where things did not work out, where the man did not get down from the horse, where nobody came. She knew those versions existed. She had been living in the edges of one of them for 14 months. What she believed instead was something less comfortable than fate and more honest, that it mattered who you were on any given morning, that the impulse to stop or not to stop was not random. It came from somewhere. It came from what a person had made of themselves through years of choices she would never know the full inventory of. Silas Boone had stopped because Silas Boone was the kind of man who stopped. And he was that kind of man because of everything that had made him and unmade him and remade him in the 11 years on this ranch and the years before that. You could call that fate, or you could call it character, which was harder and more interesting and more true. She folded the letter and put it in the desk drawer where she kept the important papers now, organized by date and subject, a system that had grown naturally from the accounting work and that Silas used without comment, which meant he trusted it. She went to make lunch. But they married in September, under the cottonwoods along the creek at the edge of the east pasture. Not the east pasture because it was Noah's land, though it was, but because in late September the cottonwoods along that creek went a particular yellow that was unlike anything else Clara had seen. A pure and serious yellow that didn't perform, didn't try for anything. It just was. She'd mentioned this once, in passing, and Silas had said nothing at the time, and 2 weeks later he'd asked if she'd want to do it there, and she'd understood he'd been holding the detail since she'd mentioned it, carrying it carefully. That was Silas. He held things carefully. The ceremony was conducted by a justice of the peace from Black Ridge named Harold Greer, who was 73 and had been marrying people in Crail County for 30 years, and who treated each ceremony with the same steady attention he'd given the first one, which Clara found she was moved by in a way she hadn't anticipated. Some people got tired of the things they did repeatedly. Greer hadn't. That meant something. Marty stood up as witness, which he did in his best coat and with his hat in his hand and with an expression of such determined emotional neutrality that it communicated its opposite entirely. Noah stood beside his mother. He was the one who'd asked, 3 weeks before, whether he could call Silas something other than Silas. He'd asked this directly, at breakfast, in the middle of a conversation about fence posts, which was how Noah asked the important things, sideways, embedded in something ordinary, as if the directness of the question needed the cover of context. Silas had put down his coffee. He'd looked at the boy for a moment. "What would you call me?" he'd said. Noah had been ready for this. "I don't know. Something." He'd looked at his plate. "Not what I called my father. That's—" He stopped. "That's his. I just meant something else. If that's all right." Silas had been quiet long enough that Clara had been about to intervene, not sure what the intervention would be, but feeling the weight of the silence. "When I was a boy," Silas said, "I had an uncle. On my mother's side. He wasn't my father. My father was alive then, but he was the one who showed me how to do most of the things I know how to do, fix things, work with animals." He paused. I called him by his first name, but it meant more than that. Noah had considered this. What was his name? George. Noah had looked at this information from several angles. "I'll just call you Silas," he'd said, "but it'll mean more than that." Silas had picked up his coffee again. "All right," he'd said, and that was that. And it was enough. And maybe it was more than enough because it was honest. And honest was always worth more than tidy. Under the cottonwoods, with the creek running behind them and the yellow leaves coming down in the light wind, Harold Greer said the words. They were old words. Greer had been saying them for 30 years and hadn't changed them because they didn't need changing. And Clara listened to them and felt their weight, which was different from what she'd felt the first time she'd stood somewhere like this. She was a different person now. Not a better person, necessarily, and not a worse one, so it's just more specific. She knew more about what she was choosing and why. She looked at Silas while Greer spoke. He was looking at her. He looked at her the way he looked at things he wanted to understand from the inside. Not possessively, not romantically, just with that absolute attention, the attention of a man who didn't bother with things he wasn't serious about. She thought, I know who this is. I have watched him handle difficult horses and difficult weather and difficult paperwork and a difficult child who was not his and then became something adjacent to his. I have watched him buy colored pencils and leave them on a table without asking for acknowledgement. I have watched him carry someone he didn't know and ask nothing in return, and carry that same impulse forward for months without letting it become something he expected to be thanked for. She thought, whatever made him stop on that road, whatever years of solitude and grief and quiet work had shaped the man who got down from that horse. I am grateful for all of it, not just the outcome, all of it. Greer asked his question. Clara said yes. Silas said yes. Greer shook their hands with the practiced warmth of a man who meant it. Marty, who had been staring at the creek during the ceremony with an expression of geological stoicism, said, well, very quietly, to no one in particular. Noah, who was standing at Clara's left, looked up at the cottonwoods with the calculating expression of a boy who was trying to estimate how many of the yellow leaves were going to fall in the next 10 minutes, and whether that was a problem he could solve. The people of Black Ridge came. Not all of them. Not the man from the land office who had reasons of his own for staying away, and not the landlord who'd locked them out of their room in January, who also had reasons. But more than Clara expected, more than she would have predicted on the morning she'd stood at the washing line in that town and watched people walk past a sick woman and a kneeling child. They came quietly, in the way of people who are aware they owe something and are not quite sure how to account for it. Ruth Anders from the dry goods store, who had been one of the ones who'd slowed her pace that January morning before deciding not to stop. She came and brought a pie and shook Clara's hand with the grip of a woman who was trying to put something into a handshake that she hadn't been able to put into that January morning. Clara shook her hand back and didn't make it mean more than it was, and didn't make it mean less. Some of the others were the same, aware, in the vague way that communities sometimes became aware of things without having to discuss them directly, that something had happened in their town that winter that they had been on the wrong side of. Not terrible people, most of them. People who had been afraid and who had learned something about what their fear had cost, and who were showing up now in the only way that was still available to them. Clara did not hold it against them. She understood the arithmetic of fear too well, had lived inside it for 14 months herself, moving from town to town, calculating who might be bosses and who might not, deciding every morning what she could afford to trust. Fear was not the same as cruelty, even when it produced the same outcomes. What she believed was this: the people who'd walked past that bench were mostly not bad people. They were people who had practiced the wrong habit for too long, so the habit of deciding, before they'd fully looked, that whatever was happening over there was not their problem, and habits were not destiny. She was living proof of that. The habit could break. A single morning, a single act could break it. That was the thing about what Silas had done that people misunderstood, she thought. They talked about it now. She'd heard it in the conversations at the store. The way his name was said with a different quality than it had been said before. As if what he'd done was extraordinary. As if it required some particular gift or courage that ordinary people couldn't be expected to have. She didn't think that was right. She thought what it required was practice. The practice of paying attention. The practice of letting what you see actually reach you, rather than managing it from a distance. Silas had been alone for 11 years, and he had, in all that solitude, developed the specific discipline of looking at things directly. He'd had to, on a working ranch, alone. If you didn't look at things directly, you missed the thing that was about to cost you. He'd applied this discipline to a woman on a bench in a way that changed 4 lives, and possibly more. That wasn't magic. That wasn't heroism, in the frontier novel sense of the word. That was a man who looked at what was in front of him and then did what the looking required. She thought about this often. She thought it was the lesson of all of it, if you wanted to put it that way. Not that one good man had saved her, because she'd had a hand in her own saving too, and so had Fellows, and so in a minor way had Marty and even Harold Greer, with his 30 years of steady attention to the same words. The lesson was simpler and harder than a story about rescue. The lesson was, look, actually look, let it reach you, then do what the looking requires. It sounded easy. It was the hardest thing Clara Hale, Clara Boone, could think of. The winter came again. Of course it did. Wyoming winters did not take years off for good behavior or change circumstances. The snow came down in November with the same absolute conviction it had come down the November before, and the one before that, and the one that had nearly killed her. But the ranch was different now, not transformed. That was the wrong word. Too absolute, too much like a story about magic rather than a story about work. The fences were better maintained, which mattered in a hard winter. The accounts were organized, which meant Silas understood what the ranch could afford and what it couldn't, and there were no surprises in the ledger in November that hadn't been accounted for in October. There was more food in the cellar than there had been the year before, because Clara had spent the fall putting it there. There was Marty in the bunkhouse with his pipe and his opinions about wire, which was worth a great deal more than the bunkhouse upkeep. And the house was different in the way that houses became different when people lived in them fully rather than occupying them provisionally. Not decorated. She hadn't turned it into something soft and cluttered, because Silas would have found that uncomfortable and she found it impractical. But full. There were books on an actual shelf now, rather than in a crate on the floor. There was a coat rack at the door with 3 different sizes of coat on it. There was a row of Noah's drawings pinned to the wall in the hallway. She'd asked if she could do this, and Silas had said yes in the tone that meant he'd already been thinking about it. There was a garden in December that was dormant, but that had been real in summer and would be real again. Noah's drawings had changed over the months. In January, he'd drawn empty spaces and locked gates and a boy beside a woman who was lying down. In February, he'd drawn the barn, the fence, a horse that looked more like a horse each time he tried it. Through the spring, he'd drawn the ranch and its particulars. The tools hung in the barn, the creek, the cottonwoods. In summer, he'd drawn from the window of his room, which looked east over the pasture that was now his 12 acres by territorial record. In the fall, he'd drawn the 3 of them, again, for the first time since February. But this time they were not approximate. They were specific. Clara by the garden wall, Silas at the fence, Noah between them slightly forward, which was where he placed himself in reality too. Not behind them, not between them exactly, but forward. The point of the shape they made together. Under the roof. Under one line of roof that connected all 3. He'd given the drawing to Silas without explaining it, set it on the table, and walked away to the barn, and Silas had looked at it for a long time and then put it in the desk drawer with the important papers, which was where it stayed. On the first hard night of winter, Silas lit the lamps early. All of them. The one in the kitchen, the one in the parlor, the 2 in the upstairs windows. This was not his habit. Usually he lit what was needed and no more, a remnant of long years of managing a house alone and having no reason to illuminate rooms he wasn't in. But this night he went through and lit them all, and the house was bright in a way that was visible from the road, from the far pasture, from anywhere in the shallow valley that the ranch sat in. Clara found him standing on the porch, looking out at the dark. "You lit all the lamps," she said. "I did." She stood beside him. The cold was clean and deep, the kind that had settled rather than blown in, a cold that was going to stay. "Why?" she said. He looked at the dark valley, at the road that ran through it, faintly visible in the snow-reflected light. "There used to be a ranch about 8 miles north," he said, "when I first came here, an older couple. I rode past it in a bad winter, the first year I was on this land, and I was further from the house than I should have been, and the light was going fast." He paused. "I could see their windows from a long way off. They had lamps in every window. I don't know why they did it. Maybe they always did. But I fixed on those lights, and I kept going toward them, and I made it back to my road without losing the way." He was quiet for a moment. They moved on 3 years later. House has been empty since. He looked at the dark in the direction of that empty house. "I've thought about those lamps a lot." Clara looked at the lit windows behind them, the way the light came out across the snow. "A beacon," she said. "If someone needs it," he said. "If someone's out there in the dark farther than they should be and the light is going fast," he paused. "It doesn't cost anything to leave a lamp on." She stood beside him on the cold porch and looked at the valley and thought about a boy on a bench and a man on a white horse and the long chain of small and large things that connected that morning to this one. She thought about Margaret Calls in Milford with her sister, about Ruth Deaver in Nebraska, about the third-to-last piece of Harlan Voss's machinery falling away when the light got shone directly on it. She thought about what it meant to leave a lamp on, Not for any specific person, just because someone might need it. Because the cost of leaving it on was nothing compared to what it might be worth to whoever was out there in the dark, calculating whether they could make it to the road. She had been that person. She knew what it was to look for a light. "Noah's going to want to know why all the lamps are on," she said. "He'll figure it out," Silas said. "He'll ask anyway." "I know." "He always asks even when he already knows." "I know," Silas said. "I'd rather have a boy who asks." She would too. They stood on the porch until the cold drove them in, and then they went inside to the lit kitchen where Noah was at the table with his pencils, drawing something she couldn't see yet. He looked up when they came in, registered the two of them coming in from the cold together, and looked back at his drawing with the satisfied expression of someone who has noted what needed noting. The stove was going, the soup was on, the lamps were burning in every room. The Boone Ranch sat in its shallow valley and glowed against the dark, the way a house glows when it has people in it who intend to be there. Not because everything was right or easy or resolved into neatness, because it wasn't, because life on the frontier at the edge of a new century was none of those things and never would be. The cattle still got sick, and the fences still broke, and the accounts required constant attention, and Marty's wrists still hurt in the cold, and there were mornings when the grief of what had been lost, Edgar, the years of fear, the other life that had been possible before everything fell, came back to Clara in the particular way of griefs that don't end so much as change shape, becoming something you carry differently rather than something you put down. And Silas still had mornings when the 11 years of silence sat inside him like a structure he'd built that didn't entirely dismantle, when he went quiet in the way he'd been quiet before. And Clara had learned that this was not about her and not about them, but about the parts of a person that formed before they knew you, that would always be there, that you loved around and alongside rather than in spite of. That was what loving an actual person meant, as opposed to a person you'd invented in a lonely moment. It meant the whole inventory, the difficult parts alongside the rest, the history you couldn't reach back and change. Noah drew all of this, in his way. The imperfect, specific reality of the Boone Ranch in winter, the three people and the old hand and the white horse, and the garden that was dormant and would come back, and the 12 acres along the creek that were his to grow things on someday. He pinned the drawings to the wall in the hallway and added to them over time, and the hallway became a record of a life being lived, which was what hallways were for in houses where people stayed. And the lamps burned in the windows all winter long, every hard night, sending light across the snow of the valley below without requiring anything in return. The way the best things didn't require anything in return. Not gratitude, not acknowledgement, not the assurance that anyone was looking. Just burning because burning was what lamps were for, in a dark that was real, in a cold that was real, on a road that was long and that someone, always, was still traveling. The silent rancher who had once been a legend for keeping to himself became, over the years, a different kind of story. Not a story about a man who saved a woman and a boy, though that part was true, but a story about what happened when somebody looked at what was actually in front of them and didn't look away. About how that single refusal to look away had moved through 4 lives and beyond, in ways that couldn't be fully traced or counted. Stories like that didn't have clean endings because the effects didn't end. They moved outward, the way light moved, past what you could see from where you were standing. The Boone Ranch windows glowed. The valley held them, and the road ran on past the gate into the dark, patient and long, waiting for whoever was coming next.